Hi, everybody. Tonight, let us slip through the veil of centuries and wander softly into a world long buried beneath layers of legend and time. This is not the Middle Ages of fairy tales and gleaming armor alone, but rather a candlelit journey into the hidden corners, the cold hearts, and the restless nights of those who lived in the shadows of stone keeps and towering cathedrals. Together, we shall gently unfold why, for most souls, it truly sucked to live in medieval Europe, though our telling shall be quiet and slow, like a whispered secret meant to lull you into the calm embrace of sleep. Picture now, if you will, a small village on the edge of a dark wood. The sky above is a deep, bruised blue just before the sun's first hesitant rays brush the treetops. Beneath that sky, a crooked line of cottages huddles close for warmth, their thatched roofs patched with whatever straw or reed could be found after a storm's passing. Within one of these huts, a family stirs from uneasy sleep, the thin light creeping through cracks in the shutters to find faces still lined with weariness. To waken this time was not to stretch lazily beneath soft blankets, but to rise from a lumpy bed of straw or a simple wooden board, perhaps softened by a layer of old linen if fortune allowed. The cold bit at every finger and toe, for fires burned low overnight to save precious wood. A mother might rub her hands together briskly, breathing into her cupped palms as she hushes the baby stirring beside her. A father might ease himself up with a low groan, his back stiff from days of stooping in the fields or hauling stones for the Lord's new granary. Children, if they were old enough to stand, were old enough to work. There were eggs to gather, goats to milk, and dung to scoop from the packed dirt floor where a pig or a chicken might have bedded down for warmth. The mingling sense of livestock and humanity filled the single room, for walls did not separate people from their animals, but rather enclosed them all together in a fragile bulwark against the frost. Water, that simplest need, was a small daily ordeal. A girl would lift a battered wooden bucket and make her way along a muddy path to the village well. There, she might stand in line behind neighbors, exchanging quiet words under visible clouds of breath. Sometimes the well's water tasted of earth and iron, sometimes worse. A dead rat, a cracked wall that let in filth from a nearby latrine, dangers unseen but all too real. Yet there was no other choice. Water was fetched, and any sickness that came with it was met with stoic shrugs and whispered prayers to saints whose painted faces watched from the cold nave of the village church. The day's work began with the sun still a rumor behind a shroud of mist. If it was winter, frozen ruts and hard ground made every step a test of balance and endurance. In warmer months, mud clung thick and heavy to rough shoes, dragging feet down as surely as the weight of the Lord's taxes dragged down their hopes. The Lord's fields needed tending first, always first. Strips of farmland stretched in long, narrow ribbons across hills and valleys. Men and women bent their backs together, turning soil with wooden plows, sowing seed by hand, beating back weeds with simple iron hoes. Should a plow break, it was patched with what they had, scrap wood, rawhide, a prayer that it would hold. Oxen, if they were lucky enough to have them, pulled the plow through stubborn earth. If not, human shoulders took the burden. The land did not care if one's hands bled or shoulders ached. It asked only to be fed with sweat and muscle, and the promise that, come harvest, enough grain would remain after the Lord's share was taken to keep hunger at bay. Illness lurked everywhere, a shadow at the edge of every task. A cough that lingered, a wound that refused to close, a fever that burned bright and fast. These were not inconveniences, but constant threats. Remedies came in the form of old women's knowledge, herbs gathered from hedgerows, roots dried by the hearth. Sometimes they helped, sometimes they did not. And when they failed, there were prayers and pilgrimages if one could afford to leave the fields behind. The church offered hope, but even the priest's blessings could not keep pestilence away forever. Inside the home, meals were sparse and humble. A crust of bread, tough and blackened at the edges. A thin pottage made from whatever could be spared. A handful of beans, maybe a carrot or two, boiled long enough to soften into a watery stew. Meat was rare for most. If a chicken stopped laying, perhaps it found its way into the pot, but more often it was kept alive, precious for its eggs and for the promise of more chicks in spring. As dusk approached, the world did not become easier. Tools were cleaned and stored, animals fed and penned in. The hearth fire was coaxed back to life with careful handfuls of wood, each piece chosen with a thrifty mind. Families gathered close to the warmth, shoulders brushing, eyelids drooping as smoke curled upward to escape through a hole in the roof or a crude chimney. Conversation was soft, often little more than murmured plans for tomorrow's labors or a story to hush a child toward sleep. Laughter might come too, simple, fleeting joy in a life that demanded so much. But beneath it all lay a weary resignation, the knowledge that tomorrow would be much the same. And so they drifted to sleep upon straw beds, wrapped in rough blankets that did little to chase away the cold that seeped through mud walls and drafty thatch. Dreams might carry them beyond the village for a while, into forests where fairies danced, or toward cities they had only heard of in wandering tales. But morning always returned, dragging them back to the hard earth beneath their feet and the Lord's unyielding demands. Tonight, we settle here, in this dim hut at the edge of the wood, and rest with them for a moment. This is but the first glimpse into why life in medieval Europe was so very far from the shining songs of minstrels and the bright banners of tournaments. There is much more to wander through: plagues and famines, feasts and famines again, the cold stones of castles that offered little comfort, and the streets of towns thick with refuse and secrets. But for now, close your eyes and let this small village fade softly into your dreams, a memory of hardship and stubborn hope beneath the endless turning stars. Beyond the humble cottages and the muddy tracks that tied one peasant to the next, rose the manor, solid and imposing, perched upon a slight rise of land as if to remind every bent back and calloused hand who held the right to command the land's yield. In the manor, life wore a different cloak, yet it was not always the golden raiment that tales would have us believe. For as we drift deeper into this quiet telling, we find that even those who claimed titles and lands bore burdens sharp enough to pierce silk and fur. Imagine the lord of this modest domain, perhaps a baron with a handful of sworn men, his keep little more than a stout hall of timber and stone. By the hearth, he sits upon a carved chair, the fire's glow dancing over walls hung with faded tapestries and shields scarred by generations of conflict. His table is broader than a peasant's bench, his cup filled with wine that peasants would never taste. Yet beyond this flicker of comfort, the draught seeps through the cracks in the mortar, the winter's bite curls beneath heavy cloaks, and the weight of responsibility presses as relentlessly as the cold. For a minor lord, life was a constant balancing act. Tribute owed to greater lords, or a king who from a distant throne demanded coin, men-at-arms, or loyalty in battle. To hold land was to hold a promise to fight, and though songs praised the glories of chivalry, they seldom mentioned the dread that filled the night before a summons came. To answer a call to war was to ride out knowing that steel cared nothing for title. A single well-placed arrow or a swing of a mace could level a knight and a serf alike. The manor was alive with the work of many. Servants rose as early as peasants did, stoking hearths before the sun, carrying water in heavy buckets, beating dust from the rushes that covered stone floors. The lady of the house, too, carried duties that could weigh heavier than her embroidered gowns. She oversaw the kitchens and the storerooms, mindful that barrels of salted fish, wheels of cheese, and sacks of grain must stretch through the barren months when no fresh bounty came from field or forest. She managed the household's endless hum, laundresses scrubbing linen in cold streams, maids mending worn tunics by candlelight, cooks sweating over cauldrons to prepare meals for visiting knights or traveling clerics. Marriage for those of rank was seldom a matter of affection alone. Alliances were forged at the altar, fortunes sealed in dowries, and tracts of land transferred like chess pieces on a board none could see in full. A young noblewoman, married at 14 or 15, might leave her childhood home forever, stepping into a life where her worth was measured in heirs produced and alliances kept strong through her gentle counsel or quiet endurance. Her days were not her own, but given over to duties that shaped the future of families she did not choose. Within the manor's walls, warmth flickered and faded. Fireplaces smoked more than they heated, and thick stone walls that offered defense from raiders and rival lords were also prisons for the cold. Heavy tapestries and rushes underfoot did little to banish the damp that clung to the bones, creeping into joints and lungs alike. To fall ill in these halls was often to lie awake through fevered nights, hoping the healer's tinctures would draw the sickness out before it grew teeth enough to bite deep. Feasts came, yes, long tables heavy with roasted meats, fresh bread, and wine poured freely. Yet these were not daily affairs, but displays for guests and loyal knights, moments to remind all who entered that the Lord's hall could shield and feed them, if only they bent the knee when called. For every boar laid upon a board, there were weeks when salted pork and yesterday's stew filled bellies instead. Rats found their way into storerooms, no matter how careful the watch, and spoiled food could claim lives in silence. Beyond the hall, the manor's lands stretched outward. Fields worked by peasants who owed their toil, forests where the Lord's men hunted stags, while peasants dared not snare a single hare for fear of harsh punishment. The balance between lord and serf was a fragile cord. A poor harvest, a failed levy, or a rash demand could fray it to snapping. A wise lord knew this, and his knights were often restless with thoughts of rebellion or the whisper of knives drawn in secret. Children born to the manor's family found comfort unknown to those in the village, but they too were bound by duty. Sons were trained to ride, to wield sword and lance, to read enough Latin to recite prayers, to obey the call to arms when it came. Daughters were groomed to be bartered in marriage, or, if the family's fortune allowed, cloistered safely behind abbey walls, where they might pray for their kin's souls and bring honor to the family's name. Freedom, even for the noble born, was a delicate illusion. And so, within these stone walls and timbered roofs, the story of hardship wound through tapestries of privilege. Gilded cups could not sweeten sour wine when trade routes failed. Chainmail could not stop the hunger that crept into hall and hut alike when crops withered beneath an unkind sky. Even the mightiest fortress could fall to betrayal from within, a poisoned cup, a hidden blade, or simply the slow rot of dwindling coffers. Tonight, as you rest your head and drift further into this forgotten age, hold in your mind the manor's flickering fire, the rustle of servants' feet on cold wood flagstones, the distant howl of wolves in the wood beyond. Remember that behind every high wall was a beating heart that knew fear, burden, and the chill that no furs could fully warm away. And know softly that the burdens of the lords were heavy in their own, quiet ways, woven tight with the hardships of the humble folk beyond their gates. Let the crackle of an imagined hearth soothe your thoughts now, as the night deepens and our tale waits to be told further on. As the moon traced its slow arc over the manor's peaked roofs and the peasant fields beyond, another realm stirred quietly in the shadows, one that threaded through both hut and hall, binding every soul in medieval Europe to an authority far older than any king. It was the realm of the church, of stone chapels crouched at village crossroads, of candlelit cathedrals that soared like mountains of faith, and of the quiet, unyielding presence of monks and priests who carried both comfort and command. To live in medieval Europe was to breathe religion with every dawn. From the moment a child was sprinkled with holy water at baptism, life was a chain of rites and rituals: confession, communion, penance, marriage, burial. Even the smallest village, tucked behind hedgerows and muddy tracks, would gather beneath a humble steeple, where a single bell tolled across fields and forests, calling the faithful from plow and hearth to kneel upon cold stone floors. Yet the church's walls were no certain shield against hardship. Within them, the air might be thick with incense and murmured prayer, but faith alone could not mend broken bodies or fill empty bellies. The priest, often the only literate man for miles, held the word of God and the laws of men alike. He might comfort the dying and bury the dead, but he also kept records of births and debts, sins confessed and fines owed. For peasants, the church was both sanctuary and overseer, an anchor of hope, but also another hand that reached for coin when the harvest was poor. Imagine the life of a village priest, neither noble lord nor humble peasant, but somewhere in the drifting mist between. His dwelling was simple, rough timber, a hearth that smoked in winter's chill. By day, he tended to the souls of his flock, blessing fields in spring, sprinkling holy water upon the sick in times of pestilence, and ringing the bell to mark feast days and funerals alike. His knowledge of Scripture might be deep, Yet his understanding of sickness and suffering was often little better than the folk remedies whispered among peasants in the hedgerows. Above him, power rose like the spires of the great cathedrals that dotted the land, bishops draped in velvet robes, abbots presiding over monastic lands larger than some baronies, the Pope himself enthroned far away yet ever near in the minds of kings and commoners alike. The church owned vast stretches of farmland, forests rich with game, rivers teeming with fish. While peasants sweated for their lord's share, they also owed a tenth of all they reaped to the church's tithe. A small sack of grain, a basket of eggs, a measure of honey, scraped together from cupboards already too bare. In monasteries and convents, another life unfolded in shadows and silence. Monks rose in the ink-black hours before dawn to chant prayers in cold, echoing cloisters. They tilled monastery gardens, tended orchards, copied holy texts by flickering candlelight. These quiet keepers of knowledge preserved not only scriptures, but old wisdom, herbs for healing, histories of kingdoms long fallen, the secrets of brewing ale or making fine cheese. Yet even within thick monastery walls, life could be harsh and lonely. Cold stone floors, bruised knees bent in endless prayer, and vows of poverty and chastity cut deep into the hearts of those who sometimes longed for family left behind. For the villagers beyond monastery gates, the monks' labor was both distant and close. Herbal remedies from the abbey's gardens might find their way to the village healer, or surplus grain might be given in charity when famine came clawing. Yet the monastery also wielded the power to punish those who strayed from its rigid rules, to claim lands through donations, or to pressure lords with threats of excommunication if they defied the church's will. Superstition thrived alongside faith, for the world was vast and full of shadows the church could not fully banish. A sudden illness, a cow gone dry, a storm that flattened ripe crops, these were sometimes blamed on witches, devils, or sins unconfessed. The priest might be called to sprinkle holy water over fields or to banish spirits lurking in the woods. Bells were rung to chase away thunder, relics displayed to turn aside pestilence, and villagers gathered at night to murmur prayers against demons they feared might slip through the dark. For the great cathedrals that rose like stone forests in bustling towns, faith demanded hands hardened by toil. Skilled masons chipped away for decades, sometimes centuries, shaping blocks of limestone and carving saints whose blank eyes watched over muddy streets. To stand before such soaring walls of glass and stone was to feel both small and lifted heavenward, proof that human hands could reach toward the divine, even as their owners bent beneath burdens back at home. Within these walls, candles guttered day and night before relics said to hold slivers of the cross or bones of saints. Pilgrims shuffled through the nave, blistered feet wrapped in rags, hoping for miracles, sight restored, sickness cured, sins washed clean. Yet the road to such holy places was often long and perilous, winding through forests haunted by outlaws, over mountain passes where storms could turn deadly in hours. Many never returned, swallowed by the same wilderness that gave medieval Europe its cold, indifferent beauty. So it was that faith stitched itself into every waking hour, a comfort and a chain all at once. To doubt was dangerous, for heresy could bring ruin not just to the soul but to the body. Those who whispered forbidden thoughts or dared challenge the word of the pulpit might find themselves hauled before inquisitors, questioned beneath the flicker of torchlight, penance extracted in coin, in confession, or in the crackle of a pyre built upon village greens. And so as you rest tonight and drift deeper into this quiet world of stone chapels and flickering candles, remember that even faith, which warmed so many in their darkest hours, could weigh heavy as iron upon weary shoulders. The church offered hope of heaven while reminding each soul how far they must bow to earn a place among its saints. Let your thoughts slip gently now beneath the hush of monastery walls, the slow toll of a distant bell, and the soft prayers that echo endlessly in the cold night air. Beyond the steady toll of church bells and the hush of prayer behind heavy wooden doors, the daily life of medieval townsfolk unfolded along narrow streets that twisted and turned like secrets whispered in the dark. For many, the village was not enough. They were drawn to towns. Those bustling clusters of timbered houses, workshops, and marketplaces that pulsed with life and promise. yet also with hardship as constant as the ringing of an ironsmith's hammer at dawn. Step now into one such town, a walled patchwork of thatch and timber nestled beside a sluggish river. In the chill dawn, the air is already thick with the mingling scents of humanity, baking bread, horse dung, tallow smoke, and the sour tang of waste that pools in gutters and alleys. Streets are unpaved, a shifting carpet of mud and refuse that sticks to boots and hems alike. Rats dart between piles of offal thrown from kitchen doors, and mongrel dogs nose through scraps for a meal as thin as the rags on a beggar's back. The promise of town life lured many from the fields. Here was a chance, however slim, to barter skill for coin rather than labor alone. The blacksmith's forge glowed red in early hours, sparks dancing like fireflies as hammers shaped iron for plowshares and horseshoes, or perhaps the cruel curve of a blade destined for some distant skirmish. Nearby, a cooper mended barrels, a tanner worked skins in vats that stank so fiercely that entire streets might be given over to this one trade, the reek drifting on every shifting breeze. Apprenticeship was the first step for many, a boy of 10 or 12, given by his family to a master craftsman in exchange for training, shelter, and the hope that he might one day stand proud as a guild member with his own shop sign swinging above the street. Days were long, filled with blistered hands, harsh words, and the constant fear of a mistake that might earn a cuff to the ear, or worse. Masters themselves balanced on thin ledgers, materials to buy, dues to pay to the guild, taxes owed to the town's lord or bishop, bribes slipped discreetly to officials who looked the other way when rules bent beneath the weight of need. Merchants carried news as well as wares, bundles of cloth from Flanders, spices that smelled of distant ports, salt so precious that disputes over its trade could spill blood on cobblestones. Markets were noisy, restless places where farmers from nearby fields hawked cabbages and turnips beside fishwives whose wares glistened on beds of melting ice. Bargains were struck with words as sharp as knives, and coin clinked into purses that emptied too quickly for most. But with the promise of coin came the certainty of filth and pestilence. Water for washing was drawn from the same river that carried waste away, sometimes. Chamber pots emptied from windows splashed onto streets where barefoot children chased dogs and pigs. Fleas, lice, and other small tormentors flourished in the folds of cloaks and tunics. Illness moved easily from door to door, a cough here, a fever there, and soon whole streets fell silent, but for the slow creak of a handcart bearing the dead toward shallow graves beyond the town's walls. Protection from thieves and brigands was promised by stout gates and night watchmen whose lanterns bobbed along the streets after dusk. Yet within the walls, crime made its nest all the same. Cut purses brushed against crowds in the marketplace, clever fingers lifting coins and trinkets. Disputes that flared hot in daylight sometimes spilled blood in alley shadows, a dagger's whisper leaving no witness but the stray cat that slunk away, unbothered by human folly. In taverns, the common folk gathered when day's labor fell into night. Here ale flowed thick and cheap, washing down the bread and cheese that passed for supper when meat was rare and costly. Gossip tangled with the smoke of peat fires, tales of wars far off, rumors of plague ships seen upriver, whispers of a lord's cruelty or a merchant's secret ruin. A fiddler might scrape out a tune by candlelight, boots tapped upon rough floors, laughter spilling out into streets dark enough to swallow it whole. For women, town life was both cage and ladder. Some kept house, brewed ale to sell from the front room, mended clothes, or sold fresh loaves at market. Others found work in the trades, spinners and weavers, dyers whose stained hands told stories of crimson, indigo, and gold. Yet for many poor women, survival pressed them to darker corners. The brothels, tucked away behind shuttered windows, where a coin might feed hungry children, but took something from the soul that no priest's blessing could fully mend. Children darted between it all, barefoot, tousle-haired, learning early to dodge a horse's hooves or a watchman's cudgel, quick to carry water, fetch coal, run errands for a penny that might mean a crust of bread at day's end. Few would ever learn more than a handful of letters, unless the church or a wealthy merchant's favor opened the door to a scribe's trade or the scholar's bench. For most, knowledge was stitched together from overheard words, marketplace bargains, and the stories murmured beside the hearth before sleep. Yet still they came. peasants seeking freedom from the manor's fields, dreamers hoping to build a trade with their own hands, pilgrims passing through on the way to relics that might heal a wound or ease a guilty soul. Towns were crossroads of hope and hardship, their streets crowded with laughter, argument, birth, and death in equal measure. If the fields were cold and cruel, the town's promise burned hot, but it singed as easily as it warmed. So rest now, drifting through these cramped alleys and echoing marketplaces in your mind. Hear the clatter of hooves on cobblestone, the distant cry of a night watchman, the low murmur of merchants counting coins by guttering lamplight. Know that for many, the town was no safe harbor from the harsh tide of life in medieval Europe, but merely another shore, muddy, crowded, and unkind in its own restless way. Let your thoughts settle for now, and we shall wander deeper still another night. Beyond the rutted roads that wound through villages and towns alike lay the endless countryside, vast stretches of forests, moors, and farmlands that shaped the very breath of medieval Europe. Here, the land was both provider and tyrant, offering harvests that could mean survival or just as easily ruin. For those who worked the soil, every dawn carried the weight of the seasons, the whims of weather, and the fragile hope that this year might be kinder than the last. Picture now the low hum of insects in a summer field, the whisper of wheat swaying under a fickle sun. A peasant stands ankle-deep in soil cracked by drought, brow furrowed as he squints at the sky, reading clouds like omens. He knows the stories his father told, of years when rains did not come, when locusts blackened the horizon, when frost lingered late enough to kill seedlings before they rose. Such tales were not so distant legends, but memories that lived in the brittle husks of old granaries and the hollow eyes of elders who remembered hunger with a fear that never quite faded. The tools of the field were humble and often broken. A wooden plow, iron-tipped if fortune smiled, drawn by oxen whose ribs showed through patchy hides. Sowing was done by hand, seed scattered with practiced sweeps that turned muscle into memory. Weeding, reaping, threshing. Every stage demanded the same bent back and blistered palm. And yet for all this labor, the yield could vanish overnight to storms, pests, or the simple cruelty of poor soil worn thin by generations of toil. Hunger stalked the countryside with quiet persistence. If the harvest failed or the Lord demanded too much, peasants might find their larders empty by midwinter. Thin gruel stretched from day to day, children's bellies swelling from malnutrition, while hollow-eyed parents watched, helpless, but for whispered prayers that next year would be better. When bread grew scarce, roots and bark were boiled, weeds picked from ditches became bitter stews, and any scraps of salted meat were treasures guarded like relics. Famine did not come only with drought or flood. Wars could strip fields bare, soldiers trampling crops, seizing stores, burning granaries to starve out an enemy, or simply to fill their own hungry bellies. In some years, rumors of distant conflict drifted through villages like the smoke that marked an army's passing. Families hid what they could, grain buried in earthen pits, livestock herded deep into forests. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes armored riders found them anyway, their boots muddy with the same soil they ruined. When hunger reached its cruelest edge, desperation gave birth to choices that left wounds across memory and rumor alike. Stories passed down from hearth to hearth spoke of mothers forced to abandon weak children so that the stronger might survive, of quiet, terrible bargains struck in the dark woods when all else was lost. Such stories were whispered in winter, when wind rattled the shutters and the stew pot simmered nearly empty. Yet even in the hardest times, the land gave what it could. Wild berries clinging to brambles, mushrooms hidden under damp leaves, fish in streams if one knew where to set a net unseen by the Lord's watchmen. Some families risked snares in the forests, though forests too were claimed by lords who could punish poachers with harsh justice. A stolen rabbit might mean a meal tonight and a whipping or worse tomorrow. Still, a full belly often silenced fear. Seasons were a master no one could escape. Spring brought muddy paths and back-breaking plowing. Summer meant weeding, long days under a punishing sun. Autumn was frantic. Harvest must be gathered before early frost crept in. Winter, for all its rest, was a cold prison where hope for the next planting season was measured by how many sacks of grain still lay safe from rot and rats. A warm winter might be mercy. A harsh one could kill as surely as any sword. In good years, when the weather was kind and the fields generous, there was room for a different sort of life to bloom. Festivals marked planting and harvest, bright splashes of song and dance against the earth's steady demands. Ale flowed, bread was broken among neighbors, and stories stitched communities closer. In these rare moments, the weight of toil lightened just enough to remember joy. A good harvest meant full bellies, debts paid, seeds saved for next spring. But good years never lingered forever. They were fragile as morning mist, always at the mercy of what the next storm might bring. And so every peasant learned to watch the sky, to read the shape of clouds, to note the curl of leaves that hinted at rain or drought. They knew the smell of rich soil turned beneath a plow, the rough promise of grain heads swelling toward harvest. The land was their cradle and their grave, blessing and burden in one unyielding measure. So tonight, let your thoughts drift over these endless furrows and hedgerows, across pastures where cattle low beneath the moon, and forests where wild things slip unseen through tangled underbrush. Feel, if only for a moment, the calloused hands gripping a wooden handle, the ache of shoulders beneath a burlap sack heavy with hope and fear alike. Know that for so many souls, life in medieval Europe was measured not in years, but in harvests, each one a fragile promise that tomorrow might be just enough to carry them through the cold. Rest now, as the fields sleep beneath the quiet stars and the wheel of seasons turns on, relentless and slow. In the hush between fields and forests, another threat lingered like a shadow few could see coming until it was far too late. The slow, creeping reach of disease. To live in medieval Europe was to share your roof not only with kin and beasts, but with illnesses that slipped beneath doors and thatch, invisible yet merciless. Sickness made its home in damp cottages, crowded towns, and drafty castles alike, respecting no rank nor piety. Picture a small cottage at the edge of a village. A child coughs through the night, the rasp echoing off rough wooden walls. The mother lays a damp cloth on a fevered brow, murmuring half-remembered prayers to saints whose names were learned from the priest on Sundays. Outside, winter wind rattles the shutters while the father tends a small fire that can do little to fight the chill creeping under the door. There is no doctor to call, only the village healer, her pouch of dried herbs, and hope that the fever will break before the dawn breaks them. Simple sicknesses turned deadly in these centuries, colds that grew teeth, cuts that soured to infections that spread faster than any remedy could chase. A broken bone mended poorly could mean a lifetime of pain. A limp that slowed work in the fields or the forge, a burden that the family must carry in already lean times. Childbirth, too, was a door that opened both ways, a passage that welcomed new life, but just as often claimed a mother in blood and silence. Among the gravest visitors was the plague, a word that clung to the air like smoke whenever rumors drifted in from distant roads. The most dreaded of all came to be known by many names, the pestilence, the Black Death, the Great Mortality. It needed no battlements to conquer villages, no siege engines to break city gates. It arrived on fleas hidden in the fur of rats that scurried through grain stores, stowed away on ships that drifted from port to port like ghosts. Once the plague settled in, it spread with a ferocity that turned bustling towns into graveyards overnight. Imagine narrow streets where doors were marked with crude symbols, warnings that behind them lay the sick and the dying. Carts creaked along cobblestones, piled with bodies wrapped in tattered shrouds, the living crossing themselves and averting their eyes as the dead were hauled away to pits hastily dug in the frozen earth. No one was spared the terror. The wealthy fled when they could, retreating to country manors or remote forests in hopes that fresh air might carry mercy. Priests and monks moved among the afflicted, offering last rites with trembling hands, often falling victim themselves. Families locked sick rooms and nailed boards across doors, choosing to abandon kin rather than risk the same choking fate. Faith flickered in the darkness. Some saw the pestilence as punishment for hidden sins, others as proof the world was ending. Yet it was not only the Black Death that tormented medieval Europe. Fevers swept through villages each winter. Pox left faces marked for life, or snuffed out small breaths in the cradle before they had learned a single word. Leprosy crept through communities, a slow erasure of flesh and standing alike. The afflicted were forced to the margins, bells hung at their waists to warn the healthy that corruption walked nearby. Some towns built leper houses at their outskirts, stark places of sorrow where the sick waited out their days in prayers and slow decline. In cities, disease found easy prey. Crowded houses pressed families together in damp rooms where lice and fleas moved freely. Water drawn from wells or rivers carried filth that no one saw but all drank. Privies overflowed into the same streams from which children filled buckets for cooking. A single spoiled barrel of meat in the marketplace could spread sickness through dozens of households. The stench of waste rose in summer until the air itself seemed to throb with unseen threats. Yet in this world of hidden killers, understanding was as fragile as a cobweb. Many turned to charms and amulets, to prayers repeated beneath breath, to relics carried close to the heart. Wise women brewed tinctures of garlic and rosemary, monks copied old Greek texts on humors and balances, and traveling physicians, few and often costly, prescribed bleedings and purgings that sometimes harmed more than they healed. The cause of disease was guessed at through the movement of stars, the phases of the moon, the smell of the air at dusk. Still, among the fear, there was care that flickered bravely. Mothers stayed at bedsides long after hope fled. Neighbors brought what small comfort they could, a pot of broth, a folded blanket, a whispered prayer. Monks tended gardens of healing herbs within monastery walls, cultivating fennel, sage, and rue to ease the burning of fevers or the agony of festering wounds. In the face of so much helplessness, these small acts of kindness shone like lanterns flickering against a storm. When the worst passed, and it always did in time, those who remained stepped blinking into the light of life again. Fields left untended by the dead were plowed anew. Houses once boarded up were swept and mended, ready to hold laughter again, however tentative. Graves grew green with new grass, the markers weathered by rain and memory alike. Life stubbornly clung to its place, even as whispers of the next pestilence drifted on the wind. So rest now, gentle listener, and let your thoughts drift beyond the coughs and fevered murmurs that once haunted these cold stone rooms and dirt-floored cottages. Think instead on the quiet resilience that flickered in the hearts of those who faced sickness with no cure but hope, no armor but faith. In the hush of your own warm bed, far from the pestilence that once crept through thatched villages, know that each breath is a fragile victory, precious and soft in the silent dark. Beyond the hush of sickness and the silent toll of the plague carts, another peril waited among the tangled hedgerows and the winding roads that threaded through medieval Europe. Warfare. Not the grand clashes of gleaming knights and banners snapping in the wind alone, but the slow, grinding fear that drifted like smoke into every village, every manor, every trembling heart that knew how quickly conflict could snatch away what little peace the land allowed. War was never far. It lingered at the edges of fields where peasants stooped to pull weeds, at the crossroads where armored men passed through with sharpened steel at their hips and hard eyes that weighed every thatched roof as a potential prize. Lords quarreled like hounds over scraps of land, borders blurred by old grudges, fragile alliances, and the shifting whims of kings whose crowns sat uneasy on troubled brows. Picture a quiet village on a soft spring morning, mist curling above furrowed fields, birds waking the world with tentative song. Within the small cottages, families stirred to the familiar rhythm of dawn. Yet beyond the hedgerow, dust rose on the road. A company of men-at-arms approached, helms dented, mail rusted in places where last season's rain had found purchase. They bore their lord's colors stitched onto faded surcoats, but hunger gleamed sharper in their eyes than loyalty. They knocked at doors, demanded bread, ale, perhaps a young ox to carry their baggage, or a stout lad to press into service. Refusal was seldom wise. To the great lords and kings, these small villages were lines on a map, resources to be taxed, men to be summoned when banners rose. For those who tilled the soil or shaped iron at the smithy, war meant more than just service under arms. It meant the sudden loss of sons and fathers who might never return, or if they did, came back changed. Limping, hollow-eyed, haunted by the sight of fields turned into graveyards, of friends fallen into ditches slick with mud and blood. Knights, the glittering symbols of medieval warfare in many a tale, were not always noble saviors upon proud steeds. Some were mercenaries, hardened by endless campaigns, loyal to coin and survival more than chivalric codes sung by minstrels in safer halls. Their armor, fine to behold, weighed heavy on tired shoulders after days spent riding hard through rain and sleet. Beneath the steel, bruises bloomed, wounds festered, and lice found a ready home among padded gambesons that were seldom washed. Sieges brought war's cruelty home in slow, suffocating ways. A town might wake to find a ring of tents and wooden palisades sprouting on the hills beyond its walls. Days turned into weeks as ladders were built, siege engines assembled with timbers hacked from nearby forests. Arrows hissed over ramparts, stones smashed through rooftops. Food grew scarce within stout walls. Cats, dogs, rats fell into stew pots when no more grain remained. Disease, ever the quiet ally of siege, crept through crowded keeps and churches where the desperate huddled for safety. And when walls fell, there was seldom mercy. Flames devoured what swords did not. Churches looted, relics torn from altars to line a captain's purse or pay restless soldiers who had not seen coin in months. Women hid where they could, in lofts, cellars, root pits, whispering prayers that the clang of boots would pass them by. Children clutched mothers who would not meet their eyes. For peasants, whose world was already so narrow and brittle, war smashed what little shelter they could build against life's unkind winds. Yet even when battlefields lay miles away, war found a way to seep into daily life. Taxes rose to pay for armor and horses. Men were called from their plows to drill with rusty spears, leaving furrows unplanted, wives and old folk to shoulder the work alone. Merchants raised prices on grain and salt, hoarding their stores until they could squeeze coin from the hungry. Stories spread faster than armies. Rumors of neighboring villages burned, of mercenary bands who cared nothing for allegiance, of kings whose banners meant little to hungry men with swords. Among all this were the few who profited. Blacksmiths hammered out arrowheads day and night. Tanners scraped and soaked hides for leather armor. Nobles wagered on campaigns that might earn them new fiefs if they chose the winning side. Priests preached of holy causes, urging men to take the cross and ride for distant lands where the promise of salvation gleamed brighter than the risk of dying far from home. Crusades, border feuds, dynastic quarrels, each new conflict fed the old hunger for power and the old price paid by those with no power at all. When battle cries faded and armies withdrew, they left behind scarred land and graves half-marked. Villages rebuilt with timbers salvaged from burned-out homes. Fields were turned once more with shaking hands. Orphans found new homes if they were lucky, or new masters if they were not. And always, the memory of hooves on frozen roads, of torches flickering in the distance, reminded all that peace was only ever borrowed. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, let these echoes of war drift past like ghosts. Hear the faint clash of distant swords, the soft hiss of arrows lost to time, the weary sigh of a mother welcoming a son home, broken but alive. Let the thunder of iron and banners fade behind the hush of your own breath, safe for now from the ancient drums that once beat along every crooked road and silent hedge in the dark heart of medieval Europe. Beyond the clash of iron and the hush of prayers whispered under siege fires, another force shaped every life in medieval Europe, one more silent than war, yet just as relentless, the rule of law and the hands that wielded it. In an age where parchment was precious and literacy rarer still, justice often came not as written words, but as the cold certainty of punishment meted out in public squares and lonely crossroads. Imagine a village green at dawn, dew clinging to trampled grass where folk now gather in a slow-moving hush. At the center stands the stocks, a rough timber frame stained dark from countless rains and older miseries. It is here that thieves, debtors, or the unlucky souls accused of petty crimes find themselves locked in place for hours or days, bodies bent, heads bowed as neighbors pass. Some throw rotten scraps, mutter curses under breath. Others look away, shame or fear catching in their throats like thorns. Justice, to the villagers and town dwellers alike, was not some distant king's decree alone, but the living hand of the local lord, the reeve, or the traveling bailiff, whose word could bind a man tighter than any iron chain. For small offenses, stealing a loaf of bread, gathering fallen branches from the Lord's forest without leave, punishments could be swift and public. Fines were common, yet coin was rare, and when pockets lay empty, flesh paid the price instead. Those accused of greater crimes faced trials that often owed more to spectacle than fairness. A man accused of poaching might be dragged before the manor court, where his lord presided beneath a faded banner, surrounded by retainers eager to nod at the right moment. Witnesses were neighbors, some eager to speak truth, others driven by grudges older than the crime itself. The accused might swear innocence by holy relic, by the bones of some long-ago saint kept behind the church altar. Or they might submit to ordeal, trials by fire or water, where guilt or innocence was weighed by whether burns healed clean or a bound body sank rather than floated. Such ordeals, harsh to modern ears, made sense in a world where divine judgment was believed to hover just beyond the edge of human sight. To cast someone into a pond, bound at the wrists and ankles, and watch if they floated was to ask heaven to speak. Float and water, pure and unyielding, had rejected the soul, marking them guilty. Sink and innocence was proved in the chill embrace of the pond, though many never rose again to claim that freedom. For those found guilty of grave crimes, murder, treason, or heresy, the scaffold or gallows waited. Executions were not hidden away, but displayed beneath open sky, a grim theater to remind all what lines must not be crossed. A gallows on a hill, a wheel on a crossroads, a severed head upon a town's gate. Each was a sign that the law, however crude or cruel, had teeth. Families sometimes gathered in grim silence to watch a father or son swing, hoping that at least the soul would fly swiftly beyond the reach of mortal pain. Yet the law did not always flow downward from lord and crown alone. Villages too policed their own in quiet ways. Tithings, groups of 10 men sworn to answer for each other's deeds, or local moots where elders settled disputes over boundaries, insults, or stray livestock. Gossip served as a kind of justice all its own, rumor binding communities together with invisible threads of caution and fear. A woman whispered to be a witch might find herself shunned, her children mocked, her door marked by unseen hands long before any priest or judge came knocking. In towns, guilds held sway over craftsmen and apprentices, and their rules carried the weight of law inside the timbered walls of workshops. To break an oath to a guild, to cheat a customer, to steal a secret technique, could mean expulsion, a punishment that turned a skilled tradesman into a beggar overnight. Such rules kept order where the reach of crown or church might falter, weaving authority into every hammer blow and measure of cloth. Corruption, too, thrived in the cracks of this imperfect order. Sheriffs turned blind eyes for a coin slipped into an open palm. Officials adjusted scales in the market, their hands lingering near merchants' purses. Lords bent laws when ambition or old grudges demanded. The poor rarely found the law a friend. For them, justice could feel like yet another master. Its demands added to the long list of burdens carried day after day. Yet among all this, one found small mercies. A village reeve who knew his people might spare a widow a harsh fine when her children's bellies were already empty. A priest might stand beside the accused, speaking soft words to calm the trembling soul before the sentence came due. Some punishments spared the body, but left marks upon pride instead. A shaved head, a brand upon the hand, wounds that reminded all who saw them of sins once committed and debts once paid. So tonight, drift back through these crooked lanes and torchlit courtyards where justice wore 1,000 faces, some harsh, some pitying, some blind as stone. Hear the murmur of villagers gathered to watch a judgment given, the clang of iron closing about wrists that would bear its cold bite for days. Feel, too, the small warmth that sometimes flickered amid cruelty, a neighbor's quiet mercy, a word spoken in defense, a hand that helped the accused stand tall when shame alone might have brought them to their knees. Rest now in the hush that follows the judge's verdict, the stocks emptied, the gallows quiet beneath a soft drift of dawn mist. In this old world, where the line between order and fear was drawn with rough hands, each soul learned to step lightly, to speak carefully, and to carry the hope that tomorrow's dawn would find them still free beneath the same turning sky. The castle gates stood tall and silent under the weary moonlight, their thick wooden planks damp with a mist that drifted from the surrounding moors. Within those stony walls, life unfolded in ways both regal and raw, for even the grandeur of a fortress could not shield its dwellers from the hardships that came hand in hand with medieval life. Tonight, a hush lay over the courtyard, but behind shuttered windows and within drafty chambers, the truths of daily struggle whispered like restless spirits. A boy named Aldrich stirred in his narrow cot tucked against the servants' quarters. He was but 12 summers old, yet his back already knew the burden of toil from dawn to dusk. In the corners of the castle where torchlight flickered uncertainly, Aldrich's life was ruled by a rigid chain of duty, fetching firewood before the sun rose, hauling pails of water up the stone stairwells, scrubbing the rushes strewn across the cold flagstones of the great hall. To be young here was not to be carefree, but to be pliant and invisible, moving quietly beneath the eyes of the steward who watched for idle hands. Tonight, Aldrich's eyes flickered open as a draft slipped beneath the door, carrying with it the scent of damp hay and burning tallow. His thin blanket did little to ward off the chill. He curled tighter, trying to recall the warmth of his mother's embrace, a memory fading now, as she had long been claimed by the fever that so often swept through these walls. The castle physician, a man of grave face and solemn words, could do little for peasants' kin, for his precious herbs were reserved for those who could afford to reward his efforts. Beyond Aldrich's shivering form, the castle kitchens murmured with low voices. There, Matilda the cook labored late into the night, her hands cracked from the harsh soap made of lye and animal fat. She stirred a pot over the hearth, the steam rising and clinging to the rafters. Tonight's meal had been sparse, a thin broth with scraps of barley and a few bones picked clean days ago. The lord and lady would dine more richly, of course, their table bearing trenchers piled with salted meats and wheels of hard cheese, but what trickled down to the servants' bench was little more than a sigh of flavor. Sometimes, Matilda would sneak Aldrich a piece of crust if she could spare it, pressing it into his palm with a wink that told him not to breathe a word. Small kindnesses like this were the hidden lifelines of castle life. Without them, the chill and hunger would swallow the lesser folk whole. Above, in the lord's chambers, tapestries draped the walls, thick and heavy, stitched with scenes of hunting hounds and mythical beasts. Yet even here, wealth could not entirely banish discomfort. The great fireplaces devoured logs by the dozen, but the stone walls greedily drank away their warmth. Damp crept up through the floor. Fleas and lice made no distinction between lord or scullion. They thrived in straw mattresses and fur cloaks alike, biting through the layers that divided rank and station. The lady of the castle, Lady Ellsworth, sat by the hearth in her chamber, embroidering by candlelight. Her eyes were rimmed with weariness. Though her gowns shimmered with threads of gold and tiny glass beads, her back ached from hours bent over her needlework. Her fingers, though dainty and adorned with rings, bore the pinpricks of her craft. Idleness was a sin, the priest said, and so she stitched prayers into every hem, pleas for safe childbirth, for healthy heirs, for deliverance from the next pestilence that might come on silent wings. Outside her chamber, the guard paced the ramparts, breath fogging in the night air. His mail coat jingled softly, and beneath the iron links his shoulders slumped. Vigilance was not merely a matter of discipline, but of survival, for marauders and rivals lurked beyond the forest's edge. The guard's mind drifted to his family in the village below, his wife huddled beside the hearth, his children curled together under a patchwork blanket that barely held back the winter winds. He clenched his teeth and pressed onward, boots crunching against frost-tipped stones. Beneath the castle, in its damp underbelly, the stores lay stocked with salted fish and barrels of ale. Rats scurried among the sacks of grain, their tiny claws scratching a secret language into the night. Cats prowled the shadows, eyes gleaming green where the torchlight flickered. Here was a constant war, one of cunning and survival, tooth and claw. The steward, in his ledgers, tallied every crumb and drop, suspicious of thieving hands and hungry bellies. And beyond the stores, in the deepest recess where few dared linger, the prison cell yawned like a forgotten wound. Tonight, a man named Osric huddled there, wrists bound in iron. His crime, a handful of apples plucked from the orchard to feed his starving children. Justice here was swift and cold, and Osric's eyes stared into the dark, wide, and glassy, wondering if the Lord's mercy would extend to him come morning. His breath rose in shallow clouds as rats crept closer, drawn by the scent of stale bread left to mock him. In this cold weave of stone and fear and flickering hope, the castle lived and breathed as a creature of contradictions, offering shelter from marauders, yet breeding its own cruelties within. For all its towers and banners, its stained glass and Latin prayers, it could not protect its own from hunger, nor grant warmth enough to soften the relentless grasp of the chill. Aldrich turned again in his cot, listening to the distant howl of wolves that prowled the forest's edge. He wondered if the wolves envied those within the castle walls, or if they pitied them. His eyelids drooped as exhaustion, that final mercy of the poor, tugged him down into uneasy dreams. Tomorrow would bring the same ache of cold stone beneath bare feet, the same sting of harsh commands, the same fleeting taste of bread crust slipped from a kind hand. Outside, the moon drifted behind a cloud, and the castle's silhouette merged with the blackness of the moor. Life within these walls, grand as they might appear to passing travelers, was but a tapestry woven with threads of hardship, threads that frayed under the weight of each cold dawn. And so, under the whispering hush of the night, the stones kept their secrets close, while within their grasp, souls like Aldrich's dreamed of warmth they might never touch. Dawn crept slowly over the castle, painting its towers and battlements in a pale wash of gray. The first rooster's call drifted up from the village below, muffled by the morning mist that clung to the earth like a shroud. Within the castle walls, the hush of night began to stir into the quiet rustle of waking life. Boots scraping on flagstones, whispers between servants, the hiss of embers coaxed back to flame. Aldrich rose before the steward's cane could rap against the door. His breath plumed in the cold air as he fumbled for his threadbare tunic, stiff from the damp. Beside him, another boy stirred, Edwy, older by 3 winters but smaller from hunger's steady claim on his bones. They exchanged no words, none were needed. Their tasks awaited, indifferent to their dreams or weariness. The boys stepped into the corridor, where rushes scattered over the stones did little to soften the bite of the floor beneath their bare feet. They passed under an arched window that let in the dawn's pale glow, the frost etching delicate patterns on the sill. Below, the courtyard slowly filled with the movements of others like them, stable hands rubbing warmth into the flanks of restless horses, maids hurrying toward the laundry yard with baskets piled high with linen stiffened by the night's chill. Aldrich's first task led him to the well. He and Edwy hefted the iron bucket, lowering it into the dark, echoing shaft. The rope burned against their palms as they pulled it up, heavy with cold water that splashed against their tunics. One slip, one broken rope, and the punishment would come swift, a day's ration withheld, perhaps worse. Yet they moved carefully, wordlessly in rhythm, their young faces set in expressions too old for their years. At the kitchen door, steam rolled into the yard as Matilda barked orders at 2 sleepy girls who hauled sacks of flour from the pantry. She caught sight of Aldrich and Edwy, her face softening for a heartbeat as she motioned them inside. They set the buckets by the hearth where the pot bubbled with a morning pottage of oats and what scraps she could find. The smell of it teased their empty bellies, but neither boy dared linger too near the pot. Matilda pressed a sliver of boiled turnip into Aldrich's palm as she turned away, her eyes darting toward the steward's shadow crossing the courtyard. Aldrich tucked it into his sleeve, a tiny secret warmth against his skin. Such small rebellions kept hunger's howl at bay, if only for a breath or two. Outside the kitchens, the blacksmith's hammer struck its first blows of the day, a ringing that echoed off the walls like a heartbeat of iron. Sparks danced in the chill air as the smith, a broad-shouldered man named Roderick, bent over the anvil. His face was streaked with soot, and sweat already darkened his collar despite the dawn's cold. He paused to lift his eyes toward the sky, lips moving in a quick prayer that his back would hold strong, that no tool would crack and rob him of tomorrow's coin. The castle's inner yard filled with the sense of smoke and damp earth. Chickens clucked underfoot, pecking at the straw. A cluster of serfs waited at the gate, clutching baskets of eggs and sacks of grain owed to the Lord as rent for the land they tilled. A bent-backed reeve checked each measure, his wax tablet marked with symbols the peasants could not read. A woman stood apart, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, an infant at her breast. She watched the reeve with hollow eyes, her lips moving in a silent plea that he not notice the small sack she kept hidden under her cloak, an extra handful of barley she hoped to carry home to her elder children. Higher up the castle's winding stairs, Lady Ellsworth sat in the chapel, her hands clasped tight around her rosary. Morning prayers spilled from her lips in a soft murmur as the priest, robed in coarse wool dyed a fading black, intoned Latin phrases that only half the gathered servants could follow. The chapel's air was cold and smelled of wax and old stone. Candles flickered in their iron holders, their light doing little to push back the shadows that pooled in the corners like watchful spirits. As she prayed, Lady Ellsworth's mind wandered to her daughter, Avelina, who lay abed with a cough that rattled her small chest. The healer had come 2 days past, leaving a pouch of dried herbs and grave words about humors and balance. No amount of embroidery nor gilded icons could buy away a mother's dread. She whispered a promise to the Virgin Mary that she would double her alms to the abbey if only the child might wake with clear lungs and color in her cheeks. In the training yard, young squires clashed wooden swords, their laughter sharp and bright in the morning air. For them, the castle was a forge of ambition. Each bruise and blister a step toward knighthood and the glory sung by bards in warmer halls. But behind every tale of chivalry lay the unromantic truth. Wounds that festered, bones that broke wrong, futures cut short on muddy fields far from home. For now, though, their voices rose above the clang of steel and the barked orders of the drill master. Aldrich watched them as he passed, envy and awe mingling in his chest. He imagined for a moment the weight of a sword in his hand, the feel of a fine horse beneath him, the warm furs of a knight's tent. Then Edwy nudged him, reminding him of the next task, scrubbing the steps that wound up the keep's tower. They knelt together, rough brushes in hand, their knees numb from the cold stone. Each pass of the bristles left their fingers raw and pink, yet they dared not slow. Above them, the castle's banners stirred in the slight breeze, a lion rampant on a field of crimson, bright against the dull sky. It was a symbol meant to inspire awe, to remind the serfs below of power and protection. But to Aldrich, it fluttered like a distant promise, something grand yet out of reach, beautiful yet indifferent to the small struggles that unfolded in its shadow. When the final step gleamed wet and clean, Aldrich leaned back on his heels, chest heaving. He looked to Edwy, who managed a crooked grin despite the bruise blooming under his eye, a gift from the steward's cane for a dropped pail the day before. They shared no words, only the brief comfort of a glance that said, "We endure. We endure because we must." The sun crept higher, but its warmth could not find the chill corners of the stone walls. The castle hummed with life now, low voices, sharp commands, the endless shifting of feet over cold flagstones. Beneath the banners and prayers, the hardship of the day unfolded, as relentless and familiar as the tolling of the chapel bell. And so the castle breathed on, its people tucked within its ribs, each one carrying their private burdens beneath a sky that promised no mercy, only the hope that tomorrow they might wake and do it all again. As the sun climbed above the mist-shrouded treetops, the castle's shadow stretched long over the fields beyond its walls. Those fields, damp with dew and dotted with the silhouettes of bent figures, were where the true pulse of medieval life throbbed, quietly, steadily, beneath the watchful eye of the manor. In the far reaches of the castle's lands, a boy not unlike Aldrich moved through the rows of rye and barley. His name was Harl, son of a villain, bound to this land as tightly as the stones were to the keep. His hands, small yet hardened by sun and soil, tugged at the weeds that clung stubbornly between the tender shoots. His father, Wulfric, stooped a few rows over, his breath visible in the early chill as he worked with a crude hoe fashioned by the village smith. The manor's steward, a thin man named Theobald with eyes like cold iron, rode the boundary on a sturdy gelding. He kept tally of every furrow, every missing sheaf, his presence as heavy as the morning fog. Now and again, Theobald would dismount, stooping to sift the dark soil through his fingers, as though the earth itself might be hoarding a portion of the harvest that was due to the Lord. Behind him trudged a scribe, scratching marks on a piece of parchment held stiff with wax to keep the damp at bay. For Harl and the others who worked these fields, each sunrise brought the same back-breaking routine. Tilling, sowing, weeding, reaping. They knew the rhythms better than they knew the stories told by the fire. They knew, too, the pain of a poor yield. Less to keep, more owed in taxes, and never enough to quiet the gnawing bellies at home. Near the edge of the field, an old woman named Ada pulled a tattered shawl closer around her shoulders. Her hands, twisted with age, picked at the weeds more slowly now, and every so often she paused to cough, a dry rasp that bent her near double. No healer would come for her. The herbs that might soothe her chest were too precious, the physician too busy tending to the gentry within the castle walls. For Ida, there was only the hope that her granddaughter might slip her a handful of mint leaves from the herb garden, if the steward's eye turned elsewhere. Past the fields, in a clearing where a low fence kept a few sheep corralled, a shepherd boy named Bjorn stood watch with a dog at his side. His eyes traced the tree line warily, for wolves lingered here even in the warmth of summer, their hunger no less sharp than that of the peasants who tilled the earth. Bjorn's cloak was thin, patched many times by his mother's tired hands, and the crook he leaned on was nothing but a stout branch smoothed by years of his father's grip. He had no schooling, no bright dreams of knighthood or adventure. His world was the flock, the forest, the constant fear of a lost ewe costing more than his family could ever repay. As the sun rose higher, Theobald called for a halt. He gathered the workers near a rough cart where a boy no older than Aldrich ladled out thin ale and wedges of coarse bread. Harl took his share, biting into the bread that tasted more of grit than grain, feeling the dry crumbs scratch his throat. It was not enough, but it was all there was. He chewed slowly, drawing out each mouthful as though it might become a feast if he only imagined it so. Wulfric ruffled his son's hair, a brief touch of warmth in a life of callous silence. "Eat, lad," he murmured. "Grow strong so you can swing the plow better than me." Harl looked up into his father's face, lined, hollow-eyed, yet still able to muster a ghost of a smile. That smile carried more comfort than the bread ever could. Not far from the workers, hidden by the hedge that bordered the Lord's hunting grounds, a pair of children watched with wide eyes. They were thin as twigs, their hair tangled, their clothes little more than rags. Orphans, some whispered, left to fend for themselves since their parents fell to the last harsh winter. They survived on what they could steal, a few unguarded eggs, a handful of windfall apples from the manor orchard. Today they watched the bread ladled out, hoping to slip close enough to snatch a crust when the steward's gaze turned elsewhere. Back within the castle, the noble children sat at their morning lesson. In a small solar warmed by a brazier, a cleric read aloud from a manuscript, his voice dry and steady as he traced lines with an ink-stained finger. The young lordling, Edwin, fidgeted on his cushioned bench, his eyes drifting to the window where sunlight spilled onto the flagstones. His tutor rapped the table sharply, a reminder that letters and psalms mattered more than daydreams. Edwin's sister, Avelina, curled under a fur-lined blanket nearby, too weak to join the lesson. She watched her brother with half-lidded eyes, her breath shallow. In her dreams, the fields beyond the castle walls blurred with the pages of the illuminated manuscript. Bright flowers painted in gold leaf, mingling with memories of daisies picked in the meadows before the cough came. Outside that warm chamber, the distance between the children of stone walls and those of the open fields stretched like a chasm. Yet they were bound together by the same unyielding earth, the same endless turning of seasons that gave and took with equal cruelty. When the sun dipped toward its zenith, the workers trudged back to their rows. Harl knelt once more in the dirt, his knees pressing into the soft muck, his hands black with soil that clung beneath his nails. His father's shadow stretched long beside him, each weed plucked a prayer that come harvest, the yield would be enough, enough to pay the steward, enough to keep the wolves from the door, enough to hold back the hunger that waited patient and silent. Above them all, the castle loomed, its banners catching the wind that swept over furrowed fields. It promised protection, yet its stones were cold witnesses to the truth, that the land fed the walls more than the walls fed the land. And so they worked on, backs bent beneath a sky that gave them sun and rain in equal measure, hearts wrapped in the quiet hope that the coming winter might be kinder than the last. As dusk crept in and the sun dipped behind the dense woods to the west, the fields fell silent, but for the soft rustle of the breeze stirring the long grasses at their edges. The peasants, weary and caked in soil, began the slow trudge back toward their cottages, scattered along the winding path that led away from the castle's looming silhouette. Shadows lengthened, merging with the gathering mist that rose from the damp earth like breath from tired mouths. Harl walked at his father's side, the hoe resting across Wulfric's shoulders like a yoke. They said little, for words had long since worn thin under the weight of repetition, this day like the one before, and the one that would come again tomorrow. Behind them, Ada shuffled at her own pace, the small bundle of weeds she'd pulled now just a token to show the steward she had done her share. Her cough crackled in the still air, unnoticed by the crows that settled on the fence posts to watch the humans file past like so many shadows. As the path split, some veered toward the village proper, where wattle and daub cottages crouched under thatched roofs heavy with moss. Thin streams of smoke rose from rough chimneys, carrying the faint, sour scent of boiling cabbage and the sharper tang of burning peat. Harl's own home squatted at the edge of the village, its low door half-hinged, its walls patched with mud anew each spring when the rains found their way through every crack. Inside, his mother, Leofwin, waited by the hearth, stirring a pot with slow, deliberate motions. Her hands, like his father's, bore the cracked skin of labor and the heat of many winters spent leaning over the same pot, hoping the watery broth might stretch far enough to quiet every stomach. Tonight, she greeted them with a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She took the hoe from Wulfric, leaning it against the door where the handle would dry overnight, and brushed a bit of straw from Harl's shoulder as he passed. They sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor while Leofwin ladled out supper, a thin gruel with a scattering of dried peas and a crust of rye so dense it needed to be softened in the broth to chew. No one spoke until the first pang of hunger had been dulled by spoonfuls scraped clean. After, Wulfric murmured a short grace, his voice carrying a note of weary gratitude that the children still breathed, that the hearth still burned. Beyond their door, night settled over the village like a thick blanket. A distant howl threaded through the darkness, answered by the sharper bark of dogs penned close to the huts to guard against prowling wolves and thieves alike. In the next cottage, an old man tended to a gouty leg by the light of a tallow dip, muttering curses at the saints who had failed to keep the ache at bay. A young woman, her belly round with child, lay awake on a straw mattress, praying her labor would come with the next full moon and not before, for the midwife was away tending to another, and the last child she birthed alone had not drawn breath for long. In the heart of the village stood the small, squat church, timbers darkened with age, and a crude bell hung from a simple frame. Tonight, its door was barred, but by its threshold lay a beggar boy, no older than Aldrich, wrapped in a ragged cloak too thin to guard against the deepening chill. He clutched a scrap of bread filched from the steward's wagon as it passed earlier that day, nibbling it in tiny bites so that sleep might come before hunger returned. Further up the path, closer to the castle's outer wall, the Reeves house rose slightly higher than the others, a mark of his rank and his favor with the Lord. Inside, he sat by a fire that burned brighter than any hearth in the village, his belly warm with ale. He counted the coins and tokens of debt he'd gathered that day, each one a testament to the order he maintained. To him, the peasants were lines in a ledger, weights to be shifted, dues to be squeezed from stubborn soil and stubbled fields. His own sons, plump and rosy-cheeked, played at his feet with wooden toys carved by a wandering craftsman who'd traded his skill for a week's shelter. Back in the village, Harl lay curled on a pallet beside his younger sister, Edith. She shivered under the thin blanket they shared, her breath warm against his neck. He whispered tales to her, stories he half remembered from his mother's soft voice on rare nights when the fire crackled a little brighter than usual. He spoke of green glades untouched by the steward's eye, of wild deer that stood unafraid, of bread loaves so wide they fed a whole family for a week. Edith's eyes fluttered closed, lashes resting on her hollow cheeks. Harl kept talking even when her breathing deepened, the words a small shield against the dark that pressed against the cracked walls. Outside, the village sank into uneasy sleep. The night wind rattled loose shutters, carrying the smell of dung and distant smoke. Somewhere in the brush, a fox sniffed at a chicken coop, testing the frail defenses that kept thin hens from hungry teeth. The castle, its torches burning in cold sconces, watched over it all. A promise of protection, yes, but also a reminder that life here belonged not to those who labored and dreamed, but to those who counted coins behind heavy doors. And so the night stretched on, quiet, but for the restless stir of creatures and the sighs of those who dreamt of softer beds and fuller bowls. Beneath that same indifferent sky, the poor huddled close to each other, drawing what warmth they could from the promise that dawn, at least, would come again. Morning arrived once more, slipping through the village with a thin drizzle that turned the hard-packed earth to slick, clinging mud. A pale dawn spilled over thatched roofs and the slanted eaves of the cottages, dappling the narrow path that wound from the huts to the castle gates like a vein feeding life into the stone heart beyond. Inside the village's largest cottage, the Reeve rose early, his boots thumping across the floorboards as he barked at his wife to stir the fire. His sons still slumbered, curled under thick woolen blankets spun from the best fleece the village could spare. Blankets their mother kept carefully mended and aired to guard against the damp that crept into bones and bred illness in the hush of winter. The Reeve fastened his cloak at the throat, tugged on his gloves, and stepped into the drizzle with a grim look toward the east, where the sky brooded low and heavy. He had much to oversee this day. In the fields beyond the cottages, the peasants were already gathering under the watchful eyes of the steward's men. They came in twos and threes, hunched in rough cloaks or oiled skins, shouldering crude tools across their backs. Wulfric stood among them, Harl close at his side, his small face lifted to the gray sky that threatened a harder rain. The boy's boots were little more than scraps bound with cord, soaked through before the first hour passed. Still, he did not complain. He merely drew closer to his father's bulk as they waited to be assigned their share of toil. Today was the day to clear the hedgerows that crept in like a tide, reclaiming the plowland inch by inch if left untamed. A task of hacking, uprooting, binding thorny branches into piles that would be dragged by donkey carts to mend fences or feed the fires that smoldered in every hearth. It was work that drew blood from careless fingers, left scratches up and down arms already raw from rope and spade. The steward himself, Theobald, appeared at the head of the lane astride his gelding, the hooves splashing through shallow puddles. He called out names in a thin, rasping voice, marking each worker present with a charcoal stub on a scrap of parchment. His eyes lingered longer than usual on Ida when she stepped forward, her back hunched and her breath wheezing in the mist. For a moment, she looked as though she might speak, might ask for leave to rest her aching bones, but thought better of it when she saw the glint in Theobald's gaze. She shuffled onward, her small sickle clutched tight in a hand that trembled. Not far from the hedgerows, Bjorn the shepherd boy moved his small flock toward fresher grazing near the woodland fringe. He cast wary glances at the shadows beneath the trees, where he knew foxes and worse things sometimes watched. His dog, a wiry creature named Wolf, circled the sheep with practiced snaps of teeth and barked warnings. Bjorn's stomach rumbled with the memory of a breakfast that had not come. The last heel of bread had gone to his younger sister, left behind in the hut to watch the fire and keep the crows from pecking at their precious stores. At the castle, the day's rhythm was already unfolding in parallel to the village's steady ache. The great hall, its flagged floor swept clean by servants who bent double with stiff brooms, buzzed with the soft murmur of maids setting tables for the midday meal. Aldrich labored among them, his hands red and chapped from scrubbing soot from the enormous hearth that swallowed whole logs like twigs. The rushes laid fresh days before were already strewn with droppings from the dogs that roamed freely here, noble hounds prized for the hunt, yet quick to foul the corners of the hall where lesser folk must kneel and clean. Above, in a solar brightened by rain-dimmed light, Lady Ellsworth sat once more at her embroidery frame. Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the rain slid down the glass in wandering rivulets. She stitched, not for pleasure but for piety, a cloth to hang in the chapel come Lent, its threads meant to speak her devotion in ways her restless prayers never could. At her feet, Avelina dozed fitfully on a cushioned settle, her cough quieter now, but her face still pale. The soft click of needle through linen was the only sound between them, a fragile cadence that did little to hush the dull echo of worry in Elswith's heart. Down in the kitchens, Matilda wiped her brow with the back of her hand, her sleeves damp from tending the cauldron that burbled with a stew meant to feed a dozen mouths with enough left to please the steward's keen sense of thrift. The cook's apprentice, a girl with hair tied back in a rough twist, darted to and fro, grinding barley into meal, lifting baskets of bruised turnips from the larder's chill. Rats skittered overhead in the beams, eyes glinting when torchlight caught them. Matilda pretended not to notice. Better that than raise the steward's ire for failing to keep the vermin at bay. Back by the hedgerows, Harl worked beside his father, each tug at the tangled roots, sending droplets of rain down his sleeves to soak him to the skin. Once he slipped, a thorny branch catching his cheek and leaving a thin red welt that burned in the drizzle. He bit his lip against the sting and pressed on, driven by the knowledge that idleness bred suspicion and punishment in equal measure. When midday came, the steward's men handed out the noon portion, a coarse oat cake and a dipper of small ale ladled from a barrel slung over a mule. The workers gathered beneath the scant shelter of an old elm, eating in silence but for the drip of rain from the branches above. Harl chewed slowly, watching the droplets fall into the mud at his feet. Across from him, Ida coughed until she spat into the dirt, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, her breath wheezing as she forced down her share. And when the break ended, they rose again, shoulders bent, tools in hand, the day's damp chill seeping deeper into every joint and marrow. The drizzle never truly left. It clung to wool, to hair, to skin, just another weight to carry alongside the stones in their boots and the ache in their bellies. Far above, the castle's banners drooped sodden in the gray wind, mute witnesses to the countless bent backs that fed the fires within its walls. So the day crawled on under the drizzle's steady whisper, an endless weaving of toil and breath, and the small hope that when night came again, they might sleep warm enough to face another dawn, just the same. When the dusk came again, it came quietly, trailing mist along the hedgerows and softening the world into a blur of grays and pale blues. Harl's arms ached from the endless tugging and hacking. Tiny cuts stung beneath his sleeves where brambles had clawed at him all day. His father's voice, low and steady, urged him to straighten his back now and then to keep the cold from settling too deep in his bones. But there was little to be done for the weariness that weighed them both down like a sodden cloak. With the last thorny pile bundled and dragged aside for burning, the steward's men barked the signal to gather the tools and follow the track back toward the village. The carts rolled slowly behind them, drawn by patient, plodding donkeys whose ribs showed through their muddy hides. The wheels rutted the earth deeper, adding to the puddles that would greet them again come morning. As they passed the edge of the woods, Harl glanced sideways into the gathering dark. Between the bare branches, he thought he glimpsed a flicker, perhaps just the reflection of moonlight on damp bark, or perhaps a pair of watching eyes. Stories of outlaws and wild men who lurked among the trees passed from mouth to mouth around the village fires, half believed, yet never quite forgotten. Some said such men had once been like them, peasants who'd fled the steward's tally and the lord's dues when the harvest failed, who now survived like wolves on stolen grain and fear. Harl shivered and stepped closer to Wulfric, clutching his father's rough sleeve until the trees were left behind and the hedge gave way to open pasture. In the village, the dusk thickened into a chill that curled beneath doors and crept between the thatch. Thin columns of smoke rose from every hearth, the smell of peat and wood mingling with the faint tang of boiled roots and salted scraps. In Harl's cottage, Leofwin had coaxed a flame to life with dry twigs and careful breaths, feeding it with splinters saved from the last fence mending. The small fire did little to chase away the cold in the corners, but it was something bright to gather around while the night pressed close. Wulfric hung the sickle by its leather thong on the wall beside the door, where tools were kept out of the damp and within easy reach for the next day's toil. He sank onto the low bench by the hearth, easing his back against the wall with a grunt that spoke of years bent over furrows and hedgerows. Leofwin ladled out what she had, turnip broth, thin but hot, with a heel of bread to share between them. Harl accepted his share with both hands, the wooden bowl warm against his chapped fingers. They ate in silence at first, listening to the hiss of wind against the shutters and the occasional bark of dogs outside. When the bowls were scraped clean, Wulfric spoke softly, telling Leofwin of the steward's count, the hedges, the day's yield of bundles that would mend the Lord's fences come spring. She nodded, her eyes flicking to Harl's face as she brushed his hair back to see the scratch on his cheek. She dabbed at it with a rag dipped in warm water, her touch gentle though her hands were rough as burlap. In the next hut, Ida lay curled beneath an old woolen shawl, the cough rattling in her chest louder now that the day's work no longer kept it buried. Her granddaughter, a pale slip of a girl named Merwin, sat beside her with a tiny clay lamp flickering at her elbow. She hummed a lullaby learned from her mother, gone now these 2 winters past, soft enough that Ida could close her eyes and pretend, just for a moment, that warmth and ease lived here too. Closer to the castle walls, in the Reeves cottage, a small knot of village men gathered around the warmth of a larger hearth. They spoke in low voices, words carrying the weight of complaints they dared not voice when the steward's men were near. They spoke of taxes rising though the harvest had been lean, of rumors that the Lord's new levy would claim yet more of the barley they'd hoped to brew into thin ale for the winter. One man, his shoulders hunched and voice hoarse, spoke of the woods and the flicker of fire between the trees, wondering aloud if perhaps the outlaws fared better than honest folk, though none would say such a thing too loud. While they murmured, the Reeve sat apart, fingering his tally sticks, adding and subtracting debts in his mind, even as the flames cast dancing shadows across his broad-lined face. His sons, oblivious to their father's sums, played with wooden figurines near the fire, their laughter softening the sharp edge of the room's gloom. Back inside the castle, the day's grand meal had long since ended. Trencher plates scraped clean of salted venison and spiced apples left only bones and crusts for the servants to gather. Aldrich moved among the long tables, sweeping the floor clear of scraps, careful not to catch the steward's eye, lest he be accused of pocketing more than crumbs. When the last bench was pushed back in place, he slipped into the shadowed corridor that led to the scullery, pressing a half-bitten apple core into his tunic for later. Something for the boy Edwy, whose cough had worsened in the damp of the drafty storeroom where they slept. Above the hall, Lady Elswith still lingered near her embroidery frame, though her fingers now lay idle in her lap. She stared into the dying embers of her chamber's hearth, listening to the hush of the corridors beyond. Somewhere below, a hound barked once, then fell silent. Her mind drifted to her daughter's frail breath, to the rosary beads waiting on the bedside table, to the chill she felt deep in her bones despite the fur draped over her shoulders. Outside the thick walls, the rain fell harder, drumming softly on thatch and slate alike. It filled the ruts in the village path and pooled in low places where children would find it frozen come dawn. And still, in that mingling hush of wind and falling water, life folded itself into restless dreams. Dreams of better harvests, kinder stewards, fires that burned brighter than fear. Dreams that waited, as they always did, on the far side of another long, cold night. The night crept forward on a hush of rain and wind, draping its cold arms around the village and the castle alike. Inside the cramped cottages, sleep came fitfully, broken by the sigh of the wind squeezing through the chinks in the walls, by the cough of a child or the creak of an old timber shifting under the damp. For Harl, sleep came only after long moments listening to his father's breathing, to the soft murmur of his mother's prayers whispered into the darkness like a fragile shield against all that pressed close and unseen. At the castle's base, in a cramped chamber just off the kitchens, Aldrich woke long before the dawn bell tolled. He lay still for a moment on the hard pallet, listening to the rhythmic drip of water from a crack in the ceiling. Beside him, Edwy shivered in his sleep, breath catching now and then in a rasp that echoed too much like Ida's cough. Aldrich pressed a hand to the apple core hidden in the fold of his tunic. It was bruised and soft now, but it would be something. A sweetness to ease Edwy's throat when he woke. When Aldrich slipped from his cot, the stones were cold as river ice under his bare feet. He crept into the scullery, careful not to wake the steward's boy asleep on a stool by the ashes of the hearth. There he found a chipped jug and dipped it into the barrel, the water biting cold as he lifted it to drink. He paused to look at his reflection, dim and broken in the ripple of the jug's surface. For a moment he wondered if, grown tall, he might look like his father, though truthfully, he barely remembered the man's face now, only the rough warmth of a hand on his shoulder and the deep voice that called him my brave lad before vanishing into the mists of memory. Beyond the thick walls, the rain slackened, leaving the world draped in fog that clung low to the ground and muffled every sound. Bjorn, the shepherd boy, woke in his family's tiny lean-to on the village's edge. His dog, Wolf, pressed close for warmth, muzzle resting on Bjorn's thin arm. He lay still for a while, listening to the slow drip of rainwater off the sodden thatch, to his sister's quiet breathing near the hearth's dying embers. Hunger gnawed at him as it did every dawn, but today it was joined by worry. One ewe had limped yesterday, favoring its hind leg, and Bjorn knew too well what a lame sheep meant. Less wool, less coin, and a watchful steward with a tally stick ready to mark the loss against his father's meager standing. When at last he rose, he found the ewe near the paddock fence, shrouded by mist, its breath drifting like ghostly wisps in the gray. Bjorn knelt in the wet straw, murmuring soft nonsense as he ran his hands down the sheep's leg, feeling the warmth of the animal's body, the wet clinging to his sleeves. Wolf circled them, ears pricked, nose twitching at scents Bjorn could not sense. Somewhere in the thicket beyond, the forest watched them, silent but never empty. As dawn edged in, the castle stirred too. Within the chapel, where the air smelled of cold stone and beeswax, Lady Ellsworth knelt at the altar, her lips moving in a soft chant, while her fingers worried the smooth beads of her rosary. She had not slept. Instead, she had drifted from her daughter's bedside to this chill sanctuary where she felt both closer to God and yet so terribly alone. Her prayers tangled with her thoughts. Pleas for her child's lungs to clear, for her husband's coffers to hold enough silver to pay the physician should he demand more coin for stronger herbs. Matilda the cook, already up and about, stirred a pot over the low hearth in the kitchen. Her eyes flicked now and then to the door where the steward might appear, demanding to know how much barley had been set aside for the Lord's table, how many eggs the hens had laid in the coop behind the kitchens. She wiped her brow with her sleeve, pushing away thoughts of her own children asleep on pallets in a village hut, no finer than Harl's. She thought of their thin arms, the small bruises that came from play and rough shoes, the way their eyes lit up for a sweet scrap of honeyed bread, that sometimes, just sometimes, she could slip into her apron when the steward's gaze drifted elsewhere. In the fields, Wulfric rose stiffly from his straw bed. The fog was thicker than the smoke that curled from the cottage chimneys, and it seemed to swallow the lane before him as he stepped out with Harl trailing close behind. They carried the same tools, sickle and hoe, a coil of rough rope, and the same silent resolve that they would bend their backs once more for the steward's count. The hedgerows were behind them now. Today the fields waited, soil heavy with rain and cold as a grave. They would ready it for spring's first plowing, or so the steward had declared. So the ground must yield, frozen or not. At the edge of the village, old Ida lingered in her doorway, bent nearly double with her cough. Mirwin helped her wrap a ragged shawl around her shoulders. She would not join the field workers today. Her hands could find lighter work weaving rushes into mats or mending baskets by the hearth. But each day she did not stand among the row of bent backs was a day she feared the steward's eye would settle on her door with questions she had no good answer for. The village breathed its first sighs of waking life. The muted clink of pails at the well, the creak of cartwheels dragging through mud, the low bray of a donkey refusing its harness. Above it all, the castle's watchtower caught the first pale glimmer of dawn, its stone walls damp and cold but unyielding. Within, torches flickered to life in corridors still thick with the chill of night, and servants moved like shadows, hands busy, heads bowed, hearts wrapped in quiet prayers, that today might pass with no new demands, no new punishments. And beneath the dull hush of dawn, as breath fogged in the cold air and boots sank into the slick earth, The people of these fields and stones bent themselves once more to the work that tethered them to this place, bound not by choice, but by hunger, by duty, by the unspoken hope that somewhere beyond the mist, a softer morning might wait, if only they could survive the long road that led to it. When the sun at last pierced the thinning mist, it did so half-heartedly, casting a pale, watery light that turned the wet fields to a smear of dun and gray. The village path, once firm beneath cartwheels and boots, now sucked at the feet of those who passed, clutching at worn shoes and wrapping ankles in cold mud. Yet onward they trudged, Wulfric and Harl among them, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of tools and the unspoken promise that the soil must yield, even when the sky refused kindness. At the edge of the field, the steward's voice rose sharp and clear over the low murmur of the gathered peasants. Theobald sat astride his gelding, cloak drawn close against the lingering chill. His breath steamed as he barked instructions, tallying the day's work with that same waxed parchment and stub of charcoal that had measured their lives for years uncounted. He pointed first to the oldest men, those whose backs bent deepest, whose knees crackled when they knelt to test the stubborn ground. They were to break the earth where frost still clung beneath the top layer of mud. Younger men, like Wulfric and boys just sprouting into manhood, were to clear stones and roots, carrying them to the edge of the field where crude walls marked the Lord's claim. Harl was handed a basket to gather what the plow would not swallow: twisted roots, clumps of sodden thatch, the occasional shard of old pottery, rising from the earth like a whisper of forgotten days. He moved alongside his father in silence, the cold seeping into his fingertips through the wicker handle. Each handful of wet roots left grime beneath his nails, wormed cold into his sleeves. Still he worked, because to stop was to draw the steward's eye, and there was little forgiveness for slow hands in the Lord's domain. Not far away, Bjorn's path traced the boundary of the same field, driving his small flock ahead of him with soft clicks of his tongue. The lame ewe limped behind the others, her pace slow but steady for now. Bjorn's eyes flicked constantly to the trees at the far edge, half hidden by fog and the faint, drifting smoke from cottage hearths. He feared more than wolves, boys like him, with hunger as sharp as teeth, who might slip from the woods to snatch a sheep too slow to flee. Wolf padded beside him, hackles lifting at every shifting shadow. Mid-morning brought no warmth, only a hardening light that showed every wrinkle of toil. Ida sat at her threshold, weaving rushes into mats she might trade for a handful of meal or a few cracked eggs come Sunday. Her thin hands trembled with each loop, but she kept at it, stopping only to cough into the sleeve of her rough gown. Mirwin, barefoot despite the cold, crouched by the hearth inside, stirring the pot of weak broth left from the night before, hoping enough would remain when Ida's fingers grew too stiff to twist the rushes tight. Within the castle, Aldrich scrubbed at the scullery floor, gray water swirling around his knees where the flagstones dipped. His shoulders burned with each sweep of the stiff, bristled broom. The steward's boy, bigger and older, watched from the doorway, arms folded, boots dry and clean, while Aldrich's tunic clung to his skin like a damp rag. He said nothing, but now and then gave a sharp tap to the doorframe with a switch he carried, a silent reminder that the steward's reach stretched even here. Above the scullery, the great hall echoed with the clatter of the Lord's household. Trenchers were scraped clean, goblets drained of thin ale. Matilda's voice rang out above the din, calling orders to the kitchen maids as she portioned out what scraps would trickle down to the lower table, the cold bones, the stale heels of bread to be softened in broth for those who served unseen. She rubbed her wrists when no one looked, feeling the burn where hot cauldrons had splashed her more times than she cared to count. In a high chamber behind the thickest walls, Lady Ellsworth sat wrapped in a heavy cloak, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. Her eyes drifted from the dancing hearth to the window where thin light broke through the fog. Somewhere in the castle below, her husband's voice rumbled with the steward's, low and clipped, the sound of decisions she would hear of only when the coins were counted and prayers asked to stretch them further. She thought of her daughter, Avelina, now quiet in the nursery chamber, cheeks pale but dry for the first time in days. A small mercy. She traced the cross at her throat with one pale finger, lips moving in a silent promise that she would double the offering at the chapel when next she knelt before the Virgin's image, if only the fever would stay gone. By late day, the field was a patchwork of churned mud and scattered stone piles. Wulfric leaned on his hoe, watching Harl wrestle a root half his size from the clinging muck. He would have helped, wanted to. But the steward's sharp eye kept him at his own row, striking at frozen clods with a tired rhythm that never quickened and never dared slow. When at last the steward's horn sounded the day's end, the peasants let out a breath like a single weary sigh. Tools were gathered, baskets emptied of stones, the ground left raw and waiting for the plows that would come when frost gave way for good. Harl wiped his hands on the rough edge of his tunic, skin red and raw, mud caked beneath his nails like proof of a day well given to the land. Wulfric ruffled his hair, one small gesture of warmth against the damp evening that closed in around them. Together, they joined the slow file of weary bodies trailing back toward the village, boots squelching in the deepening mud. Behind them, the steward counted the piles, his gelding stamping impatiently at the edge of the field. Far above, the castle's silhouette darkened against the deepening dusk, its walls catching the last thin smear of sunlight before night rose again, cold and heavy, to remind every bent back that tomorrow and the day after would come just the same. Night returned with a hush that seemed deeper than before, folding itself around the village like a damp cloak. The path from the field to the scattered cottages was marked by footprints pressed deep into the mire, each one holding the day's toil in its muddy imprint. Here and there, torches flickered outside doorways, small, wavering islands of warmth that did little to hold back the dark pressing in from the open fields. Inside Wulfric's cottage, the hearth was coaxed back to life with careful patience. Leofwin fed it splinters and scraps, nursing the embers until they caught and glowed. She set a small pot of water to warm, its thin steam twisting upward into the thatch overhead. Harl sat near the hearth, legs drawn to his chest, hands outstretched to catch what little heat escaped. His eyes were half closed, his lashes damp with sweat and grime. Even the warmth bit at his cracked skin, but he would not pull away. Better the sting than the chill that waited in every shadowed corner. Wulfric sat beside him, his back against the rough plank wall, shoulders slumped but eyes still open. He spoke softly to Leofwin about the steward's new tally, about the rumors drifting down from the Reeves cottage that more grain might be claimed for the castle's stores this season. An early levy, they said, to prepare for a visit from the Baron's men before the thaw. Leofwin listened without interruption, her hands never pausing as she laid out a scrap of linen to mend the hole in Harl's tunic. Her needle moved with quiet resolve, threading in and out as though each stitch might hold their frayed life together a little longer. In the next cottage, Ida lay wrapped in every rag and blanket Mirwin could find. The girl sat at her feet, spooning lukewarm broth to her grandmother's lips when she woke enough to swallow. Between sips, Ida drifted into muttered prayers, half-remembered psalms woven with bits of old folk charms, a whisper to the saints and to the shadows that they might spare her bones one more winter. Mirwin only nodded, her small face pale in the flickering lamplight, her hands warm against Ida's paper-thin skin. Outside, the drizzle that had threatened all evening turned to a steady, misting rain. It tapped on thatch and shutter alike, carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke through the village lanes. Bjorn, the shepherd boy, lay curled in a patchwork of old furs beside the hearth in his family's lean-to. Wolf, the dog, pressed tight against his back, the ewe with the lame leg penned close by the wall, where Bjorn could hear her soft breath and the occasional shift of hooves. He closed his eyes against the sound of rain on the low roof, telling himself stories in his head, tales of green pastures and warm barns, of flocks so fat and healthy that no steward's tally could ever empty them. At the castle's gates, the guard changed his post, stamping numb feet and shifting the weight of his spear from one hand to the other. The wind carried the faint echo of the village, dogs barking at shadows, the distant bleat of sheep, the occasional clatter of a door unlatched by the restless gusts. The guard pulled his cloak tighter, the rough wool scratching his chin, and peered out into the darkness where the road vanished into the trees. He wondered who else watched from there, unseen, bandits perhaps, or hungry men turned wolf by the bite of winter's lean months. Inside the castle, Aldrich crept through the scullery's narrow passage, the apple core long since eaten and its sweetness just a ghost on his tongue. Edwy lay bundled on their shared pallet, breathing easier for now. Aldrich knelt by him, brushing damp hair from his brow, whispering promises of thicker blankets and fresh bread come spring, even if he did not quite believe them himself. Outside the scullery door, the steward's boy snored on a stool, his head lolling against the wall, a half-finished ledger on his knee. In the upper chambers, Lady Ellsworth lingered at her daughter's bedside. Avelina's small chest rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed too fragile for the vast silence of the room. Beside the bed, a single beeswax candle burned low, its pool of light holding the shadows at bay by mere inches. Lady Ellsworth pressed her fingers to Avelina's wrist, feeling the faint flutter beneath skin pale as linen. Her lips moved without sound, a prayer now too weary to be spoken aloud. Beyond the window, the rain traced lines down the glass like the ink of old, faded letters she once wrote to a mother she barely remembered. Down in the kitchens, Matilda sat alone at the long table. The fire in the great hearth behind her hissed and popped, a kettle swinging gently on its iron hook. She cradled a small cup of broth she'd hidden away, sipping it slow as she stared at the blackened beams overhead. Tomorrow would bring more bread to knead, more meat to salt, more scraps to guard against the steward's sharp tally. But for this moment, there was only the warmth of the cup in her rough hands and the soft patter of rain outside, soft enough that she could imagine it was something kinder than it truly was. Through the thatch and timber, the village dreamed in fits and starts. Somewhere, a mother soothed a crying babe with a low hum. Somewhere else, a man lay awake counting the coins hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Never enough. Never enough. The world beyond the walls of cottage and keep breathed its own secrets into the night, rustling the hedgerows, stirring the ashes in cold hearts, whispering through narrow lanes where the mud lay deep and the hope lay deeper still. And so the night held them all in its damp embrace, lords and laborers, children and hounds, hunger and hope tangled together beneath the same rain-heavy sky, waiting for dawn's pale promise to stir them once more from uneasy sleep. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a dull mist that clung to the thatched roofs and left beads of water trembling on the bare branches that ringed the village like silent sentinels. The fields beyond the hedgerows glistened under the weak morning light, patches of churned mud and frost-crusted earth, where the peasants' footprints from the day before had already softened back into formlessness. What was done one day was half undone by the next. Such was the way of the land that never truly yielded, only lent its grudging harvest to hands that begged it so. Inside Wulfric's cottage, the hearth embers pulsed faintly as Leofwin coaxed them back to life. She breathed gently on the flame until it caught, feeding it twigs gathered when the hedges were cut back last autumn. Beside the hearth, Harl sat upright but drowsy, his eyes crusted with sleep, hands tucked into his sleeves for warmth. His tunic, newly mended by his mother's careful stitches, still smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. Wulfric sat on a stool sharpening his old hoe with a small wet stone, each scrape of metal on stone a slow rhythm that matched the beat of rain dripping from the eaves outside. He said little as he worked, but when he looked up, his eyes settled on Harl, with a softness that belied the roughness of his cracked hands. He thought of the fields waiting, of the steward's voice that would rise sharp and hard before the sun cleared the mist. Yet he also thought, fleetingly, of summers he barely remembered now, when fields seemed less cruel, and his own father's laughter still lingered on the wind. When the embers were coaxed to a small flame, Leofwin ladled the last of the thin barley gruel into a wooden bowl. She pressed it into Harl's hands, nodding for him to eat every drop. It was not enough, but it would have to do. They would eat better, she promised in silence, when spring's first shoots rose, when the hens laid well, when the steward's back was turned long enough to let Matilda's mercy slip a crust or a handful of scraps their way. Outside, the village slowly stirred to life. Bjorn emerged from his lean-to, rubbing sleep from his eyes, as Wolf barked at a pair of crows pecking at the muddy path. The lame ewe stood apart from the small flock, head lowered to the wet ground. Bjorn laid a gentle hand on her flank, whispering soft promises as if she might understand that he needed her well, that one sheep's strength might stand between his family and the steward's anger come shearing time. Further along the lane, Mirwin pushed open the rough plank door of Ida's cottage. The old woman still lay wrapped in her shawl, her breath shallow but steady for now. Mirwin knelt to the hearth, feeding it with dry rushes she'd gathered behind the church wall, her small face set in quiet resolve. She knew Ida's cough would worsen with the damp. She knew the midwife could do little but mutter charms and tie sprigs of dried rosemary above the door. So she kept the fire alive, her small rebellion against the chill that crept through every gap in the walls. At the castle gates, the guard changed once more. Boots thudded on slick flagstones as the night watch gave way to the fresh-eyed lad who would stand these hours with spear in hand and back straight, though his thoughts drifted more often to the stew waiting in the barracks than to threats beyond the walls. He watched the village path idly, seeing bent figures move through the morning mist, shapes that never changed, only grew older, thinner, more bowed with each season that turned. Within the kitchen yard, Matilda stoked the great oven's coals, the heat a blessing even as it scorched her raw hands. She directed the kitchen girls with brisk nods, her mind counting how many trenchers must be filled for the Lord's table, how many bones she might set aside unseen. There was always someone hungry in the lower chambers. Aldrich, Edwy, the washer girls with their raw knuckles plunged into icy tubs, always someone for whom a crust was a treasure worth a lie. Aldrich, for his part, carried a stack of trenchers into the hall, his steps careful on the slick rushes that covered the stone floor. Each plate smelled faintly of last night's feast, spiced meat scraps, roasted root vegetables, sweet wine now dried to sticky patches at the rim. He caught Matilda's eye once as he passed. She gave him the smallest nod, a wordless promise that if the steward's back was turned tonight, there might be a scrap saved for him and Edwy to share beneath the scullery stairs. Up the winding steps of the keep, Lady Ellsworth sat with her hands folded in her lap, her embroidery untouched on the table beside her. She stared at the pale square of light that filtered through the lidded glass window. Her thoughts drifted to the chapel, to the quiet hush that waited there, where the cold stone walls swallowed her whispered prayers. She longed to go, to kneel and ask again for Avelina's cough to stay gone, for the steward's tally to spare enough grain for the kitchens, for spring to come early and gentle. But her feet stayed rooted beside her daughter's bed, where the child slept curled beneath a heavy wool blanket, small breaths warm against the chill that lingered in every corner of the keep. Out beyond the walls, the fields glistened under the weak sun that broke through the mist at last. Wulfric lifted his hoe, Harl at his side with his basket once more. Stones waited to be lifted, frostbitten clods to be broken, roots to be teased from earth that gave grudgingly but always demanded more. The steward's gelding stamped at the path's edge, steam rising from its flanks. Theobald sat straight in the saddle, parchment and charcoal at the ready, measuring, recording, weighing every bent back against the promise of the next harvest. And as the morning stretched toward noon, the hush of rain gave way to the soft, steady clink of tools on stubborn ground, the low murmur of weary voices, the quiet rustle of breath drawn deep against the damp. The land, the stone walls, the watchful trees, everything waited and watched, indifferent to the aching hands and hushed prayers that wove themselves into the sodden earth, one silent hope at a time. In the hush of a dawn that knew no comfort, a mother stirred beneath the thatched roof of her cottage, her bones aching from the straw pallet that had shaped itself around her weariness. The air within her single-room dwelling held the cold like a jealous wraith, clinging to her breath as she roused her children from dreams that offered kinder warmth than any hearth. With no glass in the window, only oiled parchment stretched taut to keep the worst of the wind at bay, the family rose into the pale gray chill, each exhalation a ghost of life fleeting into the rafters. In this village, pressed between a damp forest and a lord's unyielding fields, survival was less a privilege and more a stubborn rebellion against a world that did not much care for the peasantry's labors. The mother wrapped her children in rough wool cloaks, mended so often they bore more patches than original cloth, and pressed flat loaves into their hands. heavy with barley, coarse with ground husks, enough to quell the morning's hollow pangs. Beyond their door, mud lay thick in every path, a slick testament to the constant mist and unpaved roads that marked life's slow grind. Their neighbors emerged in the same quiet misery, exchanging nods rather than words, for conversation was a luxury best saved for warmer days by the hearth. There was work to be done, and the sun would neither linger nor hasten on their account. The children trudged toward the manor's fields, their small feet sinking into the mire as they joined the other serfs gathering near the wooden shed where tools were kept. Beside them, the mother bent to lift a wicker basket, one that would be filled, if fortune was kind, with eggs or gleaned grains from the Lord's granary. Should an extra turnip find its way into the folds of her apron, she would whisper a prayer that no steward's eye had seen. For theft, even of what grew from the land under their own feet, was a crime against the Lord's purse, and punishment could come swift and merciless. This morning, as always, the steward arrived astride his horse, clad in a heavy cloak lined with fur that mocked the peasant's thin garb. He barked orders to the men to mend a collapsed fence, to the women to scrub the floors of the manor's outbuildings, to the children to pluck stones from the far field, so the plow might run smoother when the thaw came. His voice carried the weight of a man who had never known the ache of frostbite in his toes or the dull thrum of hunger that could not be soothed. As the mother stooped to her chores, her mind drifted to the village gossip, how a neighbor's child had taken ill the week before. A simple fever that should have broken with warmth and broth, but instead worsened with each passing dusk. There were no physicians here, only the wise woman who brewed her teas and muttered incantations that the church frowned upon, yet tolerated when desperation overshadowed doctrine. But the child's cough had turned to silence in the night, and now his parents moved about like shadows, lips cracked with grief, yet still compelled to toil, lest they lose what little the Lord allowed them to keep. In the manor's courtyard, the mother knelt by a trough to scrub clothes, stiff with dirt and sweat. Her hands plunged into icy water again and again, red and raw, the soap a precious cake of lye that burned her skin but spared the cloth a deeper grime. She hummed under her breath, a lullaby she barely remembered learning, its melody a fragile tether to a gentler world she had never truly known. Hours crawled by in a haze of aching limbs and half-swallowed tears. The children worked alongside her, too small to lift stones without stumbling, but old enough to know they must not rest where the steward's gaze might find them idle. Now and then, one would steal a glance toward the manor's high window, where the Lord's children watched in idle curiosity, their hands pressed to glass imported from far-off lands, a luxury worth more than any peasant's lifetime of labor. When dusk began to bleed into the sky, the villagers drifted homeward in small knots, their boots trailing mud through the commons. Back within her cottage, the mother set what scraps she'd gleaned into a thin stew. The pot hissed over the hearth, steam rising to mingle with the low whispers of her children as they huddled together. The youngest fell asleep against her shoulder before the broth could fill his belly, worn down by a day that asked more than his small bones could offer. She watched the flames flicker, the shadows dancing along the low beams above her head. The winds outside worried the shutters, their song a reminder that tomorrow would come much the same as today. Hunger would return with the dawn, cold would find its way through every chink in the walls, and the steward's voice would echo across the fields once more. Yet in the hush of that humble room, she let her eyes close for a moment, the weight of her world pressing her downward. She dreamed not of riches, nor of feasts or velvet gowns. She dreamed only of a morning when her children's feet would not bleed from frost and stones, of a night when no fever would claim them, while she could do nothing but hold their hand and pray for mercy from a heaven that seemed always just beyond reach. Outside, the last embers of the day's pale light faded behind the naked branches of the wood. The earth lay sodden and silent, as if holding its breath for spring's reluctant return. And within the quiet of her dream, the mother carried hope like a fragile ember cupped between callous palms, an ember she dared not let die, for in this cold, hard world, it was the only warmth she truly owned. Beneath a moon that offered more chill than light, a lone figure made his way along the rutted track that led from the edge of the village to the old forest. His cloak, threadbare and patched, did little to guard him from the damp fingers of the night air. Each footstep stirred the fallen leaves, brittle with frost, yet he moved with the quiet patience of one well accustomed to slipping unnoticed between shadow and thicket. He was called Ealdred by the handful who knew him, though many in the village spoke his name only in hushed tones. Some called him a poacher, others a keeper of old ways that the church had not quite managed to smother beneath its sermons and threats of damnation. To Eldred, such words mattered little. He went to the forest because the forest gave him what the Lord's meager charity never would: a brace of rabbits when the children's ribs showed too plainly, a handful of herbs to cool a fever when prayer alone proved powerless. Tonight he carried his snares and a battered lantern, its flame shivering in the drought that wound through the bramble. The forest in daylight belonged to the Lord and his gamekeepers, men quick with cudgel and rope. But in darkness, when the keepers' hearts called them home, the trees belonged to Aldred and the quiet creatures that stirred within. He paused beneath an ancient oak, its gnarled boughs clutching at the night sky like a supplicant's hands. Here, he knelt to set a snare where a fox trail crossed the narrow path. His fingers worked deftly despite the cold, the wire coiled just so, baited with a morsel he could scarce spare. He listened as he worked, ears attuned to the nocturnal song, a distant owl's low call, the rustle of a vole beneath the underbrush, the whisper of wind threading through skeletal branches. As he rose, the lantern's glow caught a glint among the roots, a patch of herbs, half buried by fallen leaves. He crouched again, pulling free the tender stems, brushing away the soil with care. Feverfew, yarrow, wild garlic, his mother's voice drifted through memory, naming each green sprig with reverence. Such plants were a lifeline to those too poor for a physician's Latin mutterings and costly tonics. Eldred tucked the herbs into the leather pouch at his belt, a soft smile warming his wind-chapped face. Beyond the oak, the land sloped downward toward a shallow stream. He moved along its bank, peering into the dark water that carried secrets from the hills to the village's wells. Here, sometimes, trout lingered beneath the overhang of mossy rocks. He checked the line he'd left hidden 2 nights before, empty save for the telltale bite marks of something clever enough to steal the bait, but not foolish enough to be caught. He sighed, neither angry nor defeated. The forest offered what it would, no more, no less. Hours slipped by in a hush of muffled footsteps and the soft click of traps set in hollows known only to him. The lantern's flame waned with the oil in its belly, so he stilled it with a careful breath and let the night claim him fully. In darkness, his senses sharpened. He could smell the distant wood smoke drifting from the manor's chimneys, the tang of damp moss beneath his boots. The moon, pale and watchful, guided him more faithfully than any road marker. When at last he turned back toward the village, his sack held the modest bounty of his quiet rebellion, a pair of rabbits, limp and warm still, and the herbs tucked close to his breast to guard them from frost. He slipped from tree to tree, the forest thinning until it yielded to the Lord's cleared fields, silvered now by frost that shone like powdered glass. At the hedgerow that ringed the village, Ealdred paused to listen for the tread of the night watch. Though the steward's men were lazy in their rounds, they could be cruel when stirred from their half-sleep by a figure returning from the woods. He waited until their muttered voices drifted away behind the smithy, then ducked through a gap in the thorn and crept along the shadowed backs of cottages. He reached the low door of a house, half sunk into the earth, its roof furred with moss and smoke drifting thinly from its single crooked chimney. He rapped once, twice, a pattern soft but known to the woman within. The door creaked open to reveal the mother, her eyes ringed with exhaustion but wide with relief when she saw the bundle in his hands. She stepped aside to let him slip inside, closing the door firmly against the cold. Within, the air was thick with the faint sweetness of turnip broth, the hearth's glow painting the room in soft amber. The children stirred from where they lay, curled together, eyes blinking in wonder at the sight of Aldred and his prize. He knelt and laid the rabbits upon the table, the herbs beside them. The mother pressed a hand to her lips, gratitude spilling from her in silence deeper than any spoken prayer. Wordlessly, she ladled him a cup of the thin broth, its warmth seeping into his fingers. Ealdred drank it in small sips, savoring not the taste, but the rare comfort of sharing warmth with those who understood what it was to live beneath the boot heel of a world that offered so little and asked so much. When he rose to go, the children clutched at his cloak, their small hands seeking the roughness of his calloused palms. He patted each head in turn, their hair tangled but soft, their eyes wide with the fierce hope that only the truly hungry can muster. He left them then, stepping back into the night, the door closing behind him with a muffled thud that felt, in its small way, like a promise kept. Above him, the moon sailed westward, trailing the first whispers of dawn behind it. Ealdred moved through the frost-hushed village like a shade, his steps quickening as the stars faded one by one. In this fragile interlude between darkness and light, he carried with him the quiet defiance of those who refused to bow entirely, who found in the hidden corners of the forest the means to endure another cruel day beneath the manor's watchful windows. In the faint gray before dawn fully took its place, the village began to stir once more, though the sun had yet to clear the treetops that hemmed it in from warmth. Thin tendrils of smoke rose reluctantly from low chimneys, carrying with them the scent of damp wood and whatever meager scraps could be coaxed into a semblance of breakfast. It was in this hour, neither holy night nor properly day, that the steward's men came with their news, their boots leaving harsh prints in the muddy lane. The knock upon the mother's door was not the soft tap of Eldred's secret visitations, but a hard, flat rap that rattled the old wood on its crude hinges. She started from her doze beside the hearth, the youngest still curled in her lap, his breath warm against her arm. The rabbits Ealdred had brought were already gutted and hung above the embers, a promise of one meal to last across several days if stretched with broth and barley. She stood, heart-thudding, and opened the door just enough to let the cold seep in around the figures looming there. Two of the steward's men stood in the half-light, cloaks drawn close, their eyes sharp beneath low hoods. They did not ask to come inside. They pushed the door wider with a booted foot, filling the single room with the heavy scent of their leather and wet wool. The mother stepped back, gathering her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to hush the children with a glance. "There's been theft," the taller of the two began, his voice carrying the flat certainty of one who cared little for protest. "The Lord's traps found empty, the game gone missing. Some say it's wolves, but we know wolves do not carry rabbits into cottages, eh?" He let his eyes drift pointedly to the hearth where the mother's prize hung, steam rising as the meat seared gently above the embers. She swallowed, feeling her mouth dry as the ash beneath the grate. The smaller man stepped past his companion and poked at the meat with the butt of his cudgel, as if he expected it to confess its origin. "My children were hungry," she said at last, her voice a whisper that scraped her throat raw. "I found these in the hedgerow, snared and left. No man's mark upon them." "Aye," the tall man replied, his smile thin and without warmth. "A snare left by the wind, perhaps." They turned over the few things she owned, lifting the pallets, poking into the cracks between the wattle and daub walls. One held up the small pouch of herbs Ealdred had left, shaking it as if some secret might spill out. Finding nothing more, they cast it onto the table with a sneer. "It's known Ealdred walks the woods," the smaller man said. "Poacher's a poacher, but so is the one who buys his game. You know the fine for poaching, woman?" She nodded, unable to speak. She knew it well enough, a sum she could never dream to pay, which meant the debt would be worked off in labor, or paid with what few possessions she had, or worse, pressed from her in ways she could scarcely bear to name. The children watched, wide-eyed, pressing closer to her skirts as the men stepped back to the door. "You tell Ealdred," the tall man said, his eyes cold as river stones. "Tell him the Lord's patience is spent. Next time we find a snare, it won't be the rabbits that hang from the tree." And with that, they were gone, boots squelching in the churned mud, their shadows swallowed by the mist rolling off the fields. The mother sank onto the stool by the fire, her hands trembling as she reached for the pouch of herbs and tucked it beneath her cloak. The stew would go on the coals tonight all the same. She would not waste what had cost so much risk. But already she wondered how long before the steward's men came again, harder and hungrier for coin or confession. Beyond her walls, the village bent once more to its daily submission. Men took up their spades and plows, women gathered at the well with their buckets banging against thin hips, the children's chatter subdued by watchful glances over shoulders. The word of the steward's threat moved as quick as any wind, carried from mouth to mouth, woven into the fabric of fear that cloaked every roof in thatched misery. Ealdred heard it too, though no voice told him directly. He stood at the edge of the village near dusk, wrapped in the gray hush of the tree line, watching the lane where the steward's men had passed. He saw the hush in the children's play, the way grown folk dropped their eyes when his shadow fell across the path. He knew what silence cost. He'd lived his life within it, trading freedom for secrecy, mercy for risk. That night, he did not return to the mother's door, though the rabbits he'd snared had fed her children's bellies for now. Instead, he slipped deeper into the forest, his lantern unlit, the stars overhead barely piercing the net of bare branches. He found the snares he'd left, carefully sprung and buried under leaves. He walked old trails no lord's map ever marked, moving like a wraith among the ancient oaks that whispered to him of a time when the land had belonged to no one but the wind and the deer. Near the heart of the wood, Ealdred paused at a stone circle half swallowed by moss and root. He knelt there, resting his palm on the cold stones, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath. Here, he thought, was the truth that no steward could chain. The forest would not betray him. And so long as the wind found ways to slip through cracks in the Lord's walls, so too would he. In the village, candles guttered behind thin shutters, prayers were murmured into darkness that cared little for pleas. The children slept with full bellies and restless dreams. The mother lay wakeful beside the dying fire, listening for footsteps that might return with mercy or retribution. And in the hush of those sleeping hours, a question wound through every restless mind. How long could they steal from the shadows before the daylight demanded its due? When dawn bled pale and cold through the cracks in the shutters, the village woke once more to a day that promised little comfort and even less forgiveness. In the cottage where the mother lay restless, the embers of her hearth smoldered into ash, the warmth they'd given swallowed up by walls that leaked every ounce of heat into the hungry chill beyond. She rose before the children stirred, her feet numb against the packed dirt floor, and pressed her ear to the door, as if the frost-clad silence beyond might whisper what the day would bring. She gathered what scraps of broth remained from the rabbits Ealdred had risked so much to bring. Into the pot went a fistful of barley and the last wilted leaves of cabbage, stretched thin and salted with a prayer that none of the steward's men would knock again before dusk fell. She moved like a ghost about her chores, careful not to wake the little ones too soon. Children hungry before the day's toil could be a burden more cruel than the labor itself. Outside, the village lanes had become rivers of mud as the thaw pressed forward, the earth reluctant to yield its clutch of winter. Beneath the manor's watchful eaves, peasants gathered in twos and threes, their breath misting, as they waited for orders from the steward, who now prowled the courtyard like a hound too long kept from the hunt. Rumors slid like shadows through the crowd. Ealdred gone deeper into the forest, the Lord's men seeking his trail, the threat that any caught aiding him would be bound for the stocks or worse. At the well, the mother filled her pail with hands that trembled as much from fear as from the cold. Around her, the other women spoke in low voices, glancing over shoulders, words snatched away by the wind. Some pitied her for the meat that now simmered in her hearth, some envied her for the same. Hunger made saints of no one, and when punishment loomed near, even the best would barter their neighbors' secrets for a measure of mercy. In the field, the children worked under the whip of the steward's gaze, stones pried from frozen furrows, brambles cut back from pathways soon to bear carts of barley and rye. The older ones kept watch with darting eyes, calling warnings when a man in the steward's colors drew near. For now, they were safe, so long as Ealdred stayed a whisper among the trees, so long as none found the traps he set and traced them back to the cottages that waited hungrily for his spoils. Toward midday, a hush fell across the field when a rider appeared at the crest of the track that led from the distant hunting lodge. His horse, a black mare sleek and restless, marked him not as a steward's man, but as one closer to the Lord himself, a huntsman clad in dark leather, his hood thrown back to show hair bound tight at the neck and eyes that missed nothing. At his hip hung not a cudgel, but a long hunting knife, its handle worn from years of easy use. He rode past the cottages without word, his eyes sliding over the bowed heads and wary glances. He saw the children, the men with spades, the women bent at the well. He saw the hearth smoke that curled from low chimneys, each tendril a sign that somewhere within, a law had been broken for the sake of another day's life. He said nothing. He turned instead toward the edge of the forest, where the shadows swallowed the sun's feeble warmth. Word spread fast that he'd gone hunting Ealdred, the poacher, the shade in the woods who stole the Lord's fat rabbits and dared to keep a mother's child from starving. By dusk, every cottage knew the huntsman's name, Hrothar, the master of hounds, who'd once brought down a stag with nothing but his blade when the Lord's bowstring snapped. If any man could catch Ealdred, it would be him. And if he did, the price would not be paid in coin alone. In her cottage, the mother knelt before the hearth, coaxing flame from the last splintered wood. The stew's thin aroma filled the space, but did little to ease the tightness in her chest. She saw the fear in her children's eyes, too young to name it for what it was, yet old enough to sense that the meal they ate tonight was born from danger that might yet come knocking in the night. As darkness fell, Ealdred moved through the forest as he always had, barefoot over moss, cloak drawn tight to mute the whisper of branches brushing past. He knew Hrothar was in the woods now. He knew the huntsman's skill, the way he tracked by more than footprints, by broken stems, by the hush of birds disturbed from their roosts, by the faint warmth left behind where a man had paused to catch his breath. Ealdred did not quicken his pace. He did not panic. He trusted the old paths, the hidden hollows, the places where the forest still bent its boughs to hide him like a favored son. He paused at the stream, dipping his fingers into the water so cold it burned. He thought of the mother's cottage, the children's wide eyes, the promise he had made to himself that no steward's whip would force him to watch his own kin starve when the land still had gifts to give. Behind him, the forest shifted, a soft crack of twigs, the distant bark of a dog trained to chase down men as easily as beasts. Eldred smiled to the dark, not with bravado, but with an old, weary understanding. The hunt had begun. He would run not only for himself, but for every thin-bodied child who dreamed of rabbits on the hearth spit instead of hunger gnawing their sleep away. Far behind, in the village wrapped tight in the hush of night, candles flickered low behind shutters latched with hope and dread alike. Mothers whispered to fathers that perhaps Ealdred would not be found. Children dreamed uneasy dreams of forests that swallowed huntsmen whole and returned poachers safe come dawn. And the wind moved through the black branches like a hush that promised nothing but the endless turning of seasons, harsh and beautiful, cruel and generous, all in the same cold breath.